Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, where the past isn't just boring, it's brutal, mouldy, and probably trying to kill you in your sleep. Tonight, we travel not through fairy tales, but through the lice-infested stone corridors of a real medieval castle in France. Not as a knight, not as a noble lady in a velvet gown, but as you, a normal person. Or worse, a servant. And believe me, you wouldn't last a day. Let's set the scene. It's not Versailles. You're not in the Louvre. You are in a 13th century château, the kind built not for comfort, but for control, made of cold stone and colder politics. This fortress rises from a misty valley, like a wart on the French countryside. It's majestic on the outside, sure, but inside, welcome to damp, cramped quarters, endless work, and no such thing as human rights. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because you have to. There are no alarm clocks in medieval France, only the bell that tolls from the chapel tower, and believe me, that bell isn't signaling peace. It means get up or get whipped. You slept on straw, and not the charming kind you imagine from movies. This straw is full of fleas, lice and suspicious stains from whoever used the bedding before you. There is no pillow. There is no blanket. You are the pillow. You are the blanket. And your neighbor is snoring with a raspy wheeze that sounds like a dying goat. His name? Let's say Jean. He's been coughing blood for 3 days. Everyone's pretending not to notice. You pull on your one outfit, which by the way hasn't been washed in months. Laundry day in a medieval castle. That's a fantasy. Your tunic smells like onions, sweat and the faint regret of being born a peasant. The boots. 2 sizes too big and stuffed with wool because shoes are reused, recycled, and mostly reserved for the nobility. You are lucky to have anything on your feet at all. Now comes the walk up, and by up, I mean the spiral staircase. Castles were vertical nightmares, designed to confuse invaders, but they mostly just tortured servants. These stone stairs are narrow, slick and full of sharp turns. You carry a wooden bucket of water in each hand. One wrong step, and you're tumbling to the bottom with a broken ankle and no workers' comp. Remember, this is France, 1250 AD, not Paris Hilton's Airbnb. As you reach the upper service corridor, the real job begins. Fire starting. You'd think the fire would already be going in a freezing stone. And here's the fun part. If the fire smokes too much, the lady of the house will blame you for staining her tapestries, and she has every right to demand your punishment. After fire, you're off to the latrines, or more precisely, the garderobe for vertical holes in the castle walls that empty straight down into the moat, or worse, the foundations. It is your job to clean the dribbles, scrape the solids, and splash water with a ladle to freshen things up. And guess what? They used moss instead of toilet paper. You will never look at a forest the same way again. Hungry yet? Tough luck. Servants didn't eat before noon. And when you do, you'll get boiled oats, dried peas, or if you're lucky, a scrap of moldy cheese. Don't even think about asking for meat. That's for the knights and clergy. Also, knives are rare. People use their fingers. So every shared bowl is basically a medieval bacteria festival. Germ theory won't be invented for another 600 years. Bon appetit. But let's pause and zoom out. It's easy to romanticize castles. Candlelit halls, courtly dances, noble banquets. What Hollywood never tells you is that castles were military installations, not hotels. They were dark, damp, and deliberately confusing. Windows were tiny to keep out arrows. Rooms were cold to discourage lingering. Privacy was non-existent. Everything was built with the assumption that someone might attack at any time, which they often did. Speaking of attacks, have you noticed the rats yet? They're everywhere. Not pets, not cute. They're the unofficial landlords of this place. And they carry flu plague. That little pandemic? It'll be here in about 100 years. But the rats don't care. They're practicing already. Oh, and let's talk about bathing. Or rather not bathing. In 13th century France, water was often seen as dangerous. Nobles might bathe twice a year if they were extravagant. You, maybe never. You scrub with a dry rag, or if you're lucky you get assigned to the bathhouse, where you heat the water for others. By mid-morning, you've already cleaned human waste, risked your life on stairs, inhaled smoke, fed pigs, plucked geese, and polished metal armor that you will never wear. Your hands are raw, your eyes sting, your back aches, and still you're invisible. If you speak out of turn, you're slapped. If you break something, you're whipped. If you offend a noble, well, best not to. Let's not forget, this entire system is built on fear. Not just fear of punishment, but of hell. The church is watching. Everything you do is judged. Want to rest? That's sloth. Want better food? That's gluttony. Want justice? That's pride. You're told to suffer, smile and pray. God rewards pain, they say, especially yours. And if you're thinking, at least they have. If you count watching drunks juggle knives in the courtyard, or listening to the castle bards sing about disembowelments from the last crusade. Entertainment in a medieval castle was like a Monty Python sketch, written by a sadist. Let's end this segment with a little perspective. If you were magically transported to a medieval castle in France, your odds of dying within a week would be spectacularly high. From infection, from exposure. It was a fortress filled with suffering, superstition and a social hierarchy that saw you as less than livestock. So next time you visit a castle ruin and imagine yourself a lord or lady, remember you'd most likely be the one scrubbing chamber pots in silence while a knight. Let's not pretend there's some reward at the end of the day. There isn't. Because medieval castles, for all their towering pride and battlement glory, functioned like a machine designed to grind down everyone not born into power. You, the servant, the stable hand, the kitchen boy. You're not even a cog in the wheel. You're the grease, replaceable, disposable, and not expected to complain. By late morning, your job shifts from toilet scrubbing and fire stoking to something even less glamorous, chamber service. No, this is not what it sounds like. You're not delivering croissants to duchesses. You're hauling buckets of wash water to nobles who bathe once per season and think soap is suspiciously foreign. If you're lucky, you won't spill any on the stone floors, which are so uneven they feel like a twisted ankle waiting to happen. Your reward? A passing nod from a teenage noble who thinks your name is Boy. Doesn't matter if you're 50 and your knees hurt from scrubbing floors. You are invisible until you make a mistake, and then you're unforgettable for about 5 minutes, while they decide how hard to punish you. Now here's a lovely little irony of castle life. You can be surrounded by food and still be starving, while you're elbow deep in chopping onions, plucking chickens, and turning spits of sizzling venison. You're allowed to eat precisely nothing until the lords are done, and by done we mean disgustingly full. Nobles ate in courses, first roasted bird, then pies, then fish, then pastries, each served on thick slices of stale bread called trenchers, those bread plates soaked in fat and grease. Once the nobles were finished, they were scraped into buckets. That's your lunch. Medieval recycling at its finest. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the fire roars so hot it peels the flesh from your knuckles if you get too close. The head cook is a tyrant with a ladle, shouting, swearing, and if he sees you slow down he'll threaten to toss you in the oven with the boar roast. Funny thing is, he might not be joking. Let's talk about safety, shall we? There isn't any. The castle is a hazard playground. The walls sweat moisture that turns stairs into ice rinks. Roof tiles fall during storms. The well is infested with algae and frogs, and you're expected to drink it. And don't even get me started on the drawbridge. One misstep, and you're in the moat, which is not some tranquil body of water with swans. It's a stagnant sewer pit, often used to dispose of waste, dead animals, and the occasional traitor. Ah yes, the moat. So many fairy tales have done it dirty. Imagine being ankle deep in it because someone dropped a cartwheel during delivery and now you have to fetch it. That's right, you're the human retrieval system. The water is green. It smells like a rotten stew. You find half a boot and a rat caught. While you're at it, Don't dare be caught glancing toward the main hall, where the nobles are debating politics, gossiping about neighboring lords, or mocking servants' accents. You're supposed to look down, always down. Making eye contact with a noble can be seen as insolence. Too much eye contact, treason, if someone's bored enough. And in this delightful little kingdom of hierarchy and horror, you know what gets you noticed most. Failing. Drop a goblet, you're whipped. Burn the bread, you're starved. Say something clever, they'll think you're plotting rebellion. Now here's a fun fact for you. Many castles had special rooms built just for punishment. Not dungeons. That's too generous. No, I'm talking about little nooks, closets really, where you'd be locked in complete darkness with no air circulation as a lesson. They called them oubliettes, from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. That's right, they were literally designed to forget people. Still think you'd survive? Let's look at health next. Oh boy, you're probably already bleeding from a nick on your hand. That cut, it's turning red, it's warm. That's medieval, for this will kill you. Antibiotics haven't been invented. Doctors, you mean barbers who dabble in prayer and leeches. Your options are bloodletting, herbal tea or cauterization, where they burn your wounds shut with hot iron. And that's if you can convince anyone you're worth the trouble. You don't have a toothbrush, you don't have toilet paper, you don't have soap, your hair is full of lice and your feet are blistered from walking miles indoors. The concept of hygiene is vague at best, and demonized at worst. Bathing too often is considered vain. Your body odor is a badge of hard work. Your rotting teeth, a symbol of God's mysterious ways. And yet somehow the nobility survives, because they eat better, wear cleaner clothes, and don't lift a finger unless it's to point at someone else. They have cushions, they have feasts, they even get sick differently. Their illnesses are treated as spiritual trials. Yours, punishment for being poor. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, you'll be ordered to polish something silver perhaps, or a knight's armor. That's right, you polish a suit of armor that's only worn once a year, while your own clothes fall apart at the seams. The knights admire their reflections while barking orders. Never mind that most of them haven't fought a real battle in years, but they keep the fantasy alive. Honor, they say, while stepping over the servant cleaning up the dog's vomit. Here's where we pause for sarcasm. Isn't it beautiful how the social structure worked? Divine order, they called it. God made kings to rule and peasants to serve. It's all ordained from heaven apparently. And the best part, if you question it, you're committing heresy. And the only moment of true rest you'll get today is when you're sent outside the walls to fetch something, herbs from the garden, eggs from the hens, or just a bit of fresh air for your nerves. For 5 glorious minutes you see the sun breathe unfouled air, and dream of a life not soaked in ash, fear and dung. But then the bell rings again, and it's back to work, because leisure is not for people like you. By sunset your knees tremble, your stomach gnaws itself, your hands are raw, and the castle, it's just waking up for its evening rituals. Torch lighting, feast preparation, dog wrangling, wine pouring, and incidentally you, always you, silent, tired, and surviving for now. So next time someone posts a dreamy Instagram reel walking through a stone castle in France with harp music in the background, do everyone a favor, whisper this truth into their AirPods. You would have died by lunchtime. Chapter 2. Chamber Pots and Human Filth. If you're hoping your second task of the day will be a bit more dignified than fire starting or fetching goat-stained water from a mossy barrel, allow me to gently crush those dreams, because right after you've spent an hour inhaling wood smoke and blistering your palms on crude iron grates, you're called to your next assignment, managing the castle's sanitation system. Yes, you, the humble creature of labor, have been personally blessed with the divine honor of serving the château's garderobe crew, which, for the historically uninitiated, means you are the unofficial custodian of everyone's bodily waste. Let's begin with the architectural marvel known as the garderobe. This was the medieval French castle's version of a bathroom. Think stone alcoves in outer walls, with wooden seats suspended above long vertical shafts. At the bottom, sometimes a cesspit, sometimes the moat, sometimes just the cold earth. The only thing guaranteed was a smell that could curdle milk. And here's the good part. The nobles didn't wipe. Most of the time they used straw, moss, linen rags, anything absorbent and disposable. And those used bits, yeah, they went straight down the shaft, mixed with feces, mixed with urine, mixed with sickness, mixed with whatever you had for supper last night. So guess who gets to check the chute today? Now don't go thinking this is a once-in-a-while type of errand. Garderobes clog, and when they do, you're summoned to scrape and splash. There's no drain cleaner, no gloves, no privacy, just a long stick, a clay bucket, and a 1,000-year-old tradition of pretending this isn't the worst job in the known universe. Fun fact, some castles even built multiple garderobes stacked vertically, one above the other, because efficiency apparently meant building a human excrement waterfall that trickled from the upper lords down to the servants. That's not a metaphor, that's actual medieval engineering. Now while you're gagging from the stench and trying not to slip on the suspicious wet moss clinging to the shaft walls, allow me to educate you on a few delightful historical truths. First, human waste was considered natural, not dangerous. Germ theory wouldn't be a thing for another 500 years. People genuinely believed bad smells caused illness, not bacteria. So while your nose is being violated by the devil's own perfume, your lord is dining 2 floors up, blissfully unaware that dysentery is already working its way through the household. And second, these waste chutes weren't exactly secure. Rats often nested in them, so did frogs. Some even tell stories of snakes slithering up from the muck. So yes, while cleaning you might be met with something wet, alive and furious about your intrusion. Your screams will echo beautifully through the stone corridors. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate just how often servants died from infections related to sanitation. One small cut on the hand, plus a few bacteria from a nobleman's unfortunate bowel movement, and boom, your fingers swell, your skin blackens, and within days you're burning with fever in the infirmary, which is really just a hay pile with a candle. And do you know what they called it? God's judgment. That's right, your death wasn't blamed on filth or poor hygiene. It was divine punishment for some sin you didn't even know you committed. The local priest might say you looked too long at a married woman, or skipped a prayer, or perhaps God forbid you questioned why the Lord needed 10 swans when you barely had bread. Now as your shift continues, you're handed a heavy soaked linen sack. These are used rags from noble guests. Some of them are stained, others smell suspiciously like wine. It is your job to rinse them, not with soap but in the same water barrel used for cleaning dishes. Because yes, cross-contamination was a lifestyle, not an accident. Let me tell you about one more chore. Cleaning the jake. Some castles had enclosed wooden boxes for nobles who hated drafty toilet holes. These were called jakes, essentially proto-chamber pots. But unlike portable pots, these were fixed indoors and required someone new to reach in and scoop them out with a ladle. Let that sink in. And when it was your turn, you didn't wear gloves, you didn't wear a mask, you used cloth to wrap your hands, and said a quick prayer to Saint Fiacre, patron saint of unpleasant bodily duties. I wish I were joking, but there really was a saint for gardeners, hemorrhoid sufferers and poop handlers. Medieval Catholicism was oddly specific. Now imagine trying to sleep after all this. You return to your shared cell, crawling with fleas, and curl up beside 3 other servants. You still smell like bile, you didn't get a break, and your reward for surviving the garderobe is a slice of hard bread and maybe a gulp of diluted wine that tastes like it's been strained through a boot. But hey, at least you didn't fall in. That's what happened to old Henry. Henry was a stable boy who leaned too far over the chute and tumbled down into the muck. They tried to fish him out with a rope, but he drowned in human filth before they could pull him up. They buried his body outside the castle wall, near the pigsty. That was 2 winters ago. No one speaks of it now except when the shaft stinks worse than usual. Let's add a sprinkle of sarcasm, shall we? What a charming time it must have been to live in harmony with nature. No plastic, no pollution, just the simple joys of a sewage chute doubling as your personal death trap. Who needs modern plumbing when you have wooden boards and centuries of dehydration? Now here's the part where we widen the lens again. The truth is, medieval castles weren't designed for comfort. They were defensive fortresses built for wartime survival. Waste management was always a secondary concern. If a servant got sick or died, another would be brought in from the village. People were cheap and the system made sure they stayed that way. Nobles, of course, were shielded from this reality. They lived above the smell literally and socially. Their chambers were elevated, well insulated and perfumed. Some even had curtains soaked in lavender to mask the stench. But that luxury came at your expense, because while they discussed poetry and played lute music, you were elbow deep in the aftermath of their digestion. So tell me, are you still fantasizing about living in a castle? About waking up to the sound of bells and the smell of roasted duck? Because in reality, you'd be waking to the stench of medieval plumbing with your feet in filth and your hands blistered from scraping stone. And the worst part, you'd still be considered lucky, because at least you're not down in the dungeon. Not yet.
Let's be clear. If you survived the garderobe shift without vomiting or contracting a skin disease, congratulations,
You've passed one of the least discussed but most horrifying rites of passage in the medieval servant's career path. Unfortunately, there's no medal for enduring sewage, no promotion, no pay, just more work, and it gets better, because now you're chamber pot duty. Yes, the portable cousin of the garderobe. Imagine hauling around shallow ceramic bowls full of, well, human evidence. These were placed under beds or behind curtains in noble chambers. Their contents? Your problem. You walk through lavish halls with pots sloshing at your sides, praying silently to every saint you can think of that you don't trip, because if you do, that mess is yours to clean with your hands. Let's talk about smells. Castles didn't have scented candles or air fresheners. The primary scent of a château wasn't lavender or beeswax, it was urine, sweat and mildew. Stone holds moisture, and dampness leads to rot. Rot leads to mold, and mold loves castles. It grows behind tapestries, under carpets, even in grain stores where it poisons the bread. Ever had ergot poisoning? It's like LSD, but instead of a spiritual awakening, you lose a limb. And yet, despite the miasma of human waste and decay, the nobility insisted on decorative furs, thick woolen drapes, and embroidered cushions. You know what all of those things have in common? They absorb smells. So that elegant throne cushion the Duke sits on during Mass, it smells like feet, wine, mildew, and roasted pig. Still want to sit there? Here's another lovely duty, scrubbing the tiles and corners of the solar, the private noble chambers. These were the more refined rooms of the upper castle, and they demanded appearances be kept. So you're crawling around on your hands and knees, scrubbing the stone with vinegar, ashes, or if the steward's generous, a lye paste. Your reward for polishing a floor someone else will dirty. A shouted insult and a reminder to hurry along. By now, you've handled at least a dozen chamber pots, 5 loads of laundry, 2 sponge baths for nobles who refuse to clean themselves, and a partridge in a pear tree, and you haven't eaten since dawn. Let's stop for a moment and discuss class hierarchy. You, the servant, are at the bottom of a rigid social pyramid, held together with fear, tradition, and divine guilt. Above you are cooks, stewards, pages, squires, knights, priests, barons, viscounts, and finally royalty. And at each level, someone is stepping on someone else. It's like a human dung heap, and the ones at the top are just far enough away from the smell to pretend they're clean. You know what they used to say about nobles? They don't sweat, they don't stink, they don't soil themselves. God has made them pure. Of course this is nonsense, but it was convenient nonsense, because it meant when something did stink, it must be your fault, a servant's fault, and if the Duke's robe had a mysterious stain, it wasn't him, it was your negligence, and punishment followed swiftly. Now here's a charming medieval solution to keeping nobles clean without them doing anything. The bath servant. If you were lucky, rid cursed, you might be asked to assist with bathing rituals. That sounds simple, until you realize you're fetching buckets of hot water from the basement hearth, climbing 3 flights of stairs and pouring them into a wooden tub that leaks. Then you gently sponge down a wrinkled old man who demands you sing while you do it. And if he likes your voice, he might offer to make you his personal attendant, which sounds great, until you realize that means chamber pot duty, forever. Still thinking this is better than working in the fields? Let's sprinkle in another delicious fact. Disease doesn't discriminate. While nobles had more food, they also had more contact with people, priests, messengers, travelers, and often died from the same plagues as their staff. The difference? When a noble dies, it's a tragedy. When you do, it's an inconvenience. And the castle doctor, he's not really a doctor. He's a local barber, with a few herbs, a rusty knife, and a book written in Latin. His cure for anything from diarrhea to head trauma is bleeding. They slice your arm open and let it bleed into a bowl until you balance the humors. More often, you just lose consciousness and die. But hey, that's still balance, right? Oh, and childbirth. If you're a female servant, forget safety. If you get pregnant, often from a noble, because consent wasn't exactly a priority, you're expected to keep working until labor, then give birth in the same servants' hall you sleep in. Clean up after yourself. No midwife, no privacy, just a cold floor and a prayer that your baby doesn't cry too loud. Let's return to the topic of waste for a moment, because there's one more charming item we haven't covered. Night soil collection. In cities, people yelled guard before dumping waste out windows, but in castles, someone had to carry it outside and dispose of it far enough not to attract rats. That someone was you, usually in the dead of night, with a lantern, in the cold, over uneven ground. One wrong step, and you guessed. And what happens when the Lord hosts a feast and dozens of nobles stay overnight? Their chamber pots must all be collected and cleaned before dawn. by torchlight, with cloths. The smell doesn't fade, it marinates in your sinuses, a permanent reminder of your status. And perhaps the greatest insult of all, there was no thanks, no nod, no acknowledgement, only complaints, because your job, in the eyes of the castle elite, was to be invisible. If you did everything right, no one noticed. If you missed a single spot, everyone noticed. Let's close this segment with a bit of sarcastic wisdom. We romanticize castles as places of beauty and grandeur, and yes, the tapestries were embroidered, the towers majestic, and the banquets lavish. But under all that glamour was a mountain of rot, literal and metaphorical, cleaned daily by hands that history rarely bothered to name. So the next time you walk into a medieval castle museum and see a velvet rope guarding the noble chamber, just remember, behind that elegant curtain, there was probably a wooden box filled with noble waste, and someone just like you was stuck with the job of hauling it away.
Chapter 3. The Scullery Prison. By now, your nose has become numb to the perfume of human waste and the warm stink of mouldy stone. You've scrubbed enough chamber pots to earn sainthood in the Church of Eternal Misery, and your knees feel like they belong to a 90-year-old monk who's been genuflecting since the First Crusade. But don't sit down. Don't even think about resting, because the bell has rung again. This time, it's kitchen duty. Welcome to the scullery, the medieval castle's infernal furnace of labour, sweat and grease. The word scullery sounds quaint today. You might imagine shelves of clay pots, braided herbs drying by a sunny window, and a grandmotherly figure humming as she stirs soup. Strike that image from your brain, replace it with a damp stone vault, smoke so thick it could tan leather, knives clanging against bone, and a screaming cook whose voice could make a bishop cry. This is not a place of creation, this is a place of survival, and you're the one being boiled metaphorically and nearly literally. Let's begin with your position. Scullion, not chef, not assistant cook, not even dishwasher. You are below dishwasher. You are the person who cleans the dishwasher, if such a thing existed, which it doesn't. What exists is you, hunched over a cracked wooden basin, scrubbing soot-blackened pots with sand and crushed animal bones because soap is too valuable to waste on someone like you. Your shift starts before the sun rises and ends. Well, it doesn't. There are only hours until collapse. And the first task, plucking birds, pigeons, geese, swans. If there's a feast, you snap their necks quickly if you're kind, slowly if you're not strong enough. Then you dip them in scalding water, yank out feathers and scrape their skin with a dull knife until your wrists cramp and your fingers bleed. And after that, you're told it wasn't clean enough. Start again. Let's sprinkle in some noble culinary tastes while we're at it. You're not just preparing roasts, you're assembling live animal displays. Peacocks redressed in their own feathers after roasting, boarheads stuck with gilded apples, pies filled with songbirds that flutter out when cut. Yes, really, the goal is not to feed the guests. It's to impress them with the absurdity of your effort. Your station, the scullery, is tucked into the darkest, wettest part of the castle. The floor is perpetually slick with grease, spilled milk, blood and God knows what else. You've slipped twice already today, and the third time earns you a kick from the head cook, Master Roland, a man whose face is permanently flushed from wine and wrath. Let's not forget the heat. There's no chimney. The kitchen fills with smoke from open hearths large enough to roast an ox. Your eyes sting. Your lungs burn. You sweat so much your tunic clings to your ribs like a second skin of suffering. And there are flies, so many flies that you begin to understand how plague spreads faster than gossip in a monastery. But you can't stop, because nobles don't wait. The Baron wants almond paste swans and cinnamon-scented venison before sunset. The priest wants lentil stew without garlic, and the knight with the broken nose insists on black bread with crushed fennel, or he'll throw it back in your face again like yesterday. Here's a dark twist. You don't get to eat any of it. Not the meat, not the bread, not the sweet pastries you just risked losing a finger over while turning the spit. Your meal is a crust of barley loaf and a watered-down ale. Maybe a spoonful of gruel that's been reheated 7 times. You swallow it fast, half chewed in a corner behind the barrels while Roland isn't looking. If you're caught, it's a beating. And did I mention injuries? Oh yes. The scullery is a meat grinder of the living. Burns are daily. Knife cuts are expected. Slipping and cracking your skull on the stone floor, common. But the worst injury, being noticed. If the wrong noble takes a liking to you, your life becomes infinitely worse. You're summoned at night. You're asked to deliver food in private. And no one says anything, because they all know. Now let's talk about punishment. The kitchen is a brutal little kingdom of its own. ruled by Roland and enforced by older boys with too much power and not enough morality. If you drop a pot, you're made to lick the soot off it. If you burn the sauce, your hands are held near the fire to teach them a lesson. There is no union. There is no HR. There is only pain and the unholy scream of boiling oil when you pour too quickly. And still, somehow, you persist. You scrub. You fetch water from the well, careful not to drop the bucket lest the rope snap and you be blamed for ruining dinner with cursed hands. You skin rabbits, slice turnips and stir pottage that resembles the inside of a monk's boot. Hours pass. You stop noticing the sky outside has changed color twice since you started. You don't remember if it's still the same day. Let's pan out for a moment. People imagine medieval life was hard because of war. Wrong. Most people never saw a battlefield. The real battlefield was this. The castle kitchen. And you weren't fighting enemies. You were fighting fatigue, abuse and a system designed to consume your body and soul in equal measure. Criticism. Oh, let me serve it cold. We romanticize farm-to-table food, organic produce and handmade cuisine. But the real medieval food system wasn't wholesome. It was violent, wasteful, and elitist. Animals were slaughtered en masse not for need, but for spectacle. Spices were hoarded not for flavor but to flaunt wealth. Servants starved while they garnished peacock feathers with gold leaf. It wasn't rustic, it was obscene. So when someone tells you they'd love to live in a castle because the food must have been amazing, do them a favor, hand them a raw turnip, a bent knife and a dripping bucket of off, then blindfold them with smoke and yell insults in Old French for 14 hours straight. That's the real medieval tasting menu. And yet you endure. You hear the feasting in the great hall above, the laughter, the clinking goblets, the minstrels singing tales of noble bravery. Meanwhile, you're scrubbing pig's blood from your tunic with ashes and tears. You are exhausted, broken, but replaceable. So you keep stirring, keep chopping, keep surviving. Because if you don't, there's already a boy in the hallway waiting to take your place.
Evening in a medieval French castle doesn't bring peace, it brings escalation. As the sun dips below the horizon, the torches are lit, the nobles gather, and the kitchen enters its final act. The evening feast. This is not just dinner, it's a performance, a demonstration of wealth, power, and total disregard for the suffering required to make it happen. And you, of course, are center stage, but not as a star. You are the underpaid stagehand who never gets to leave the wings. Let's take you into the heart of it. You've been standing for 14 hours, soaked in sweat, soot, and animal grease. Your hands are raw, your back aches, and the smell, dear God, the smell has become part of your skin. But the Baron has guests tonight. A travelling knight from Toulouse, a bishop with a craving for quince jam, and the Baron's daughter, who wants to impress them with a 3-course spectacle. You will now orchestrate this with a crew of fellow overworked, half-starved souls who haven't slept in a full day. Course 1. Roast fowl with honey glaze. Simple? No. First, you must carefully redress the peacocks in their feathers. You skewer the cooked body, attach decorative plumes with pins, and paint the beak with egg yolk for shine. Then you carry this smouldering bird through narrow, slick corridors without dropping it. Because if you do, you'll be blamed for wasting royal food. You won't eat for 2 days. Again. Course 2. Meat pie with gilded crust. This means carefully mixing flour with egg and crushed saffron, a spice worth its weight in gold. Then brushing the pie until it gleams. If it cracks, it's your fault. If it burns, your fault. If the Baron complains that it's less golden than usual, still your fault. And you'd better smile as you carry it, because nothing pleases a noble like watching a miserable servant pretend to enjoy servitude. Course 3. Sweet wafers and marzipan animals. You roll the almond paste, shape it into pigs and lions, and add clove eyes. Does anyone eat them? Rarely. They're decorative, symbolic wealth, like hanging a chandelier in the privy. Meanwhile, the kitchen boys are chewing leather scraps to keep from fainting. And all of this takes place in a room so hot it feels biblical. The hearths are blazing, steam pours from boiling cauldrons. You can't see across the room, but you can hear someone sobbing quietly near the root bin. Probably Pierre. He burned his hand yesterday and now it's purple. No time for sympathy. The bishop's fruit compote is late. Let's talk about expectations. You're supposed to be fast, silent, clean, obedient, invisible, and competent, all while using tools that haven't evolved since the Roman Empire. You don't have a timer, thermometer, or even reliable daylight. You're guessing, and when it goes wrong, you're humiliated, publicly. The steward mocks your peasant clumsiness in front of nobles. You want to vanish. You can't. Let's pull in a dark historical twist.
Kitchens were one of the most dangerous places in a castle, not just for the fire blades or boiling liquids, but for the social violence that occurred there. Servants were routinely assaulted by their superiors. Apprentices were beaten with spoons or pots. Sexual abuse was disturbingly common, especially for younger workers. It was a lawless zone below stairs, one the nobility pretended didn't exist. And for women, even worse, female kitchen workers were often given the worst jobs: gutting animals, hauling coal, cleaning menstrual cloths from noble chambers. If they spoke up about mistreatment, they were accused of seducing someone above their station. The system blamed the victim by default. Now here's the part that really sings with sarcasm. This whole system was considered God's design: your suffering, holy; your obedience, virtue; your silence, moral strength; and the nobility, well, they were God's chosen caretakers of this divine order. It wasn't abuse, it was discipline. It wasn't exploitation, it was honor. Can you hear the angels weeping? After the feast, the nobles stumble back to their chambers. Some are drunk, some are full to the point of vomiting. One demands mulled wine at midnight. Another throws a chicken leg at a servant for being too slow. And still you clean. You scrape fat from platters, dump bones into buckets, mop wine from flagstones. The candle stubs are burning low, and you still have to refill the lard jars before sleeping. But don't go too far, because if the Baron gets hungry in the night, and he often does, he'll ring the bell. And guess whose job it is to sprint upstairs with a tray of cold bread and cheese? Not Roland. He's passed out drunk on his stool. Not the steward. He's already stolen a bottle of wine and vanished to the courtyard. You are always you. And if you're too slow, if the food's not warm, you'll be dragged before the Baron tomorrow and asked to explain why his noble belly was denied satisfaction. You'll be called lazy, insolent, maybe cursed. One complaint from a guest, and you could be transferred to the stables, or worse, the tannery. Sleep, when it finally arrives, is more like unconsciousness. You collapse onto your straw sack still in your filthy clothes. There's a wet patch under your head. Someone's foot is pressed into your spine. The rats are rustling again. You try not to think about how you used to dream of this castle, how majestic it seemed from the outside, how your mother told you that working in a noble house was a blessing. You don't feel blessed. You feel beaten. And tomorrow it begins again. Let's end on a bit of brutal truth. We love to romanticize kitchen culture as if every historical meal was handmade with love. In reality, medieval kitchens were factories of human suffering, where beauty was produced through brutality, and luxury came at the expense of dozens of broken backs and blistered hands. The nobleman's feast was the servant's famine, and every clove-studded duck was garnished with the silent screams of people like you. So the next time someone says, "I wish I could live in a castle," ask them how they feel about sweating in a smokehouse for 20 hours straight, scrubbing blood off stones with their bare hands, and being whipped for burning a custard. If they pause, hand them a lei. They'll learn faster that way. Chapter 4. Secrets behind the walls. You might think that after enduring back-breaking labor, boiling kitchens, and medieval sanitation horror, you'd earned a sliver of peace. Maybe, just maybe, the night would offer a moment to breathe. But this is a castle, not a sanctuary. And castles are not just stone and soldiers. They are also repositories of secrets. And you, poor wretch that you are about to stumble into one. It starts when you're sent to the West Corridor, late in the evening, to deliver fresh candles to the priest's chamber. The West Corridor isn't well travelled. It's tucked behind a heavy oak door, down a hallway whose windows haven't opened in years. The air is thick with dampness, and the scent of rotting linen. Your footsteps echo weirdly here, like the walls are holding their breath. You're told not to linger. You're told to knock, leave the candles, and return. But you've heard things. Whispers from other servants. The cook's boy swore he saw a figure in black vanish through a wall. The laundry maid claimed she heard screaming 2 nights ago. Screams that stopped too suddenly to be normal. Of course she was slapped for gossiping, but the story stuck with you. You reach the end of the hall, and pause before a crooked iron sconce. It doesn't match the others, older, rusted, with a strange pattern carved into the wall behind it. You're not a scholar, but it looks like Latin. You lean in to inspect it, and feel the stone shift beneath your palm, just a tremble. Then, with a low groan, a panel in the wall creaks open. Welcome to the secret passages. Every castle had them. Hidden corridors behind walls, narrow crawlways inside columns, staircases spiraling into forgotten chambers. They weren't built for mystery. They were built for war. Escape routes for nobles, observation points to spy on guests. But over time, These spaces took on lives of their own. Some were repurposed, some were abandoned, and some were simply forgotten. You step in. The passage is barely 3 feet wide. The air is colder, heavier. You can hear the castle above, the muffled laughter of nobles, the clatter of servants cleaning the hall. But here, the silence is thicker than the stone. You light one of your candles and move forward, breath shallow. You find stairs, narrow, uneven, spiraling downward. You descend. The room at the bottom is not large, just a stone chamber about the size of a pantry. But it's what's in the room that stops your heart. There's a wooden chair in the center bolted to the floor. Leather straps hang from the arms. Rusted chains are nailed into the wall. There's a smear on the stone, dried, dark, unmistakable. Blood. Someone screamed here, someone bled here, and someone made sure it never reached the great hall above. Let's pause for a historical deep breath. Torture wasn't just an invention of the Spanish Inquisition. Medieval France, especially in the turbulent centuries of feudal power struggles, used torture routinely, not in open courts, mind you. That would have been unseemly, but in secret chambers, under castles, behind false walls. Suspected spies, thieves, heretics, anyone inconvenient could be questioned. And castles weren't always loyal to kings. Many were semi-independent, run by lords who answered to no one, which meant if a noble decided you were a threat, or simply in the way, you could vanish. Your name struck from the records, your body buried in the forest, your story never told. Back to your discovery. The blood is old, but there are scratch marks on the stone, fresh ones. You turn and spot a cloth bundle tucked in the corner. Inside, a bottle of fortified wine, a small journal, and a tiny silver cross. The journal's pages are in Latin, but a few lines are clear enough. Mentions of sin, confession, punishment. You realize this wasn't just a torture room. It was a cell, a confession cell. Perhaps the priest used it, perhaps the Lord did. And then footsteps. You blow out your candle. The footsteps are slow, deliberate. They pass just above you. Whoever it is, they know this passage exists. You wait, not daring to breathe. After a full minute, silence returns. You retreat, moving quickly but quietly up the stairs, out the panel, back into the corridor, heart thudding like a drum. And when you report this, you don't, because you know what happens to servants who ask questions. They disappear, or worse, they're blamed. If you report a blood-stained torture chamber under the chapel, you'll be accused of heresy, drunkenness, or hallucination. No one will believe you, or worse, they'll pretend to, and you'll never see sunlight again. Here's the criticism you didn't ask for but absolutely deserve. Castles were not just centers of culture or defense. They were engines of control. Every corridor, every staircase, every servant's schedule was designed to keep people obedient and uninformed. Knowledge was a weapon reserved for the elite. You, the worker, weren't just physically oppressed. You were intellectually starved. And if you think secrets like hidden cells and blood rituals are rare, think again. Archaeologists have found hidden chambers in dozens of French castles, many without recorded purposes. Some contain shackles, some contain religious symbols, some are buried so deep they weren't discovered for centuries. These weren't architectural accidents. These were intentional silences. Let's touch on the priest, shall we? He lives in a modest chamber near the tower, speaks Latin no one understands, and eats from the same silver as the baron. His hands are always clean. He talks of mercy and repentance, but never seems to notice the violence done in the baron's name. When a servant girl is whipped, he turns away. When a thief loses a hand in the courtyard, he blesses the axe. And if you ask him about the West Passage, he tells you there is no passage, just drafts. And go. You return to your bunk that night more afraid than ever, not just of the nobles or the work, or the filth, but of the castle itself, its hidden spaces, its silence, the way it seems to shift while you're not looking. You realize that beneath the surface of this stone monument lies another world, unseen, unspoken, and very much alive. You close your eyes and try to sleep, but now when you hear the walls creak, you wonder, who else is listening? Morning comes, but you hardly notice it. Your body may have left that hidden chamber hours ago, but your mind stayed behind, trapped in that blood-stained room beneath the west corridor. You've seen what wasn't meant to be seen, and in a medieval castle, that's not curiosity. That's a liability. The castle seems different now, not in the way it looks, but in how it breathes. The stone corridors feel tighter, the walls closer. Every whisper between nobles, every sudden glance from a steward now seems layered with intent. You are beginning to see the structure for what it is. Not a home, not even a fortress, but a living hierarchy. One built on silence, secrets and shadows. Still, you must carry on. There's no time for existential dread when you're responsible for cleaning the ashes out of the great hearth. The feast last night ended with drunk lords throwing bones at each other, and a minstrel being chased out for singing a song about an adulterous countess. You heard someone was slapped with a goblet. That someone might have died, but no one speaks of it in daylight. The only proof is a blood smear near the dates, half wiped and quickly ignored. As you scrub the hearth, your thoughts drift back to the journal. You hid it under a floorboard in the laundry quarters, hoping no one saw you sneak it out. Its pages spoke of penance and pain, of a priest who punished flesh to save souls. Was he talking about others, or himself? And then there's that word you noticed, repeated several times. Flagella, Latin for flogging, self-punishment. It wasn't just a cell for others. It was a place the priest or someone else used to atone in secret. Not publicly, of course. Public humility was for peasants. But privately, the noble and the pious often believed that pain purified, and purification was a dangerous obsession in the medieval mind. Let's pause and zoom in on that madness. In medieval Christian thought, especially in France where the church's grip was velvet-clad iron, suffering was sacred, disease was divine correction, fasting brought you closer to God, flagellation cleansed your soul. This was the theology fed to you daily, while your bones cracked under labor. The nobility, they sinned in luxury and repented in private. You, the servant, sinned by simply existing, by being born poor, dirty and tired. But the real irony, the walls that whispered morality were the same walls that hid abuse. The priest who preached chastity may have harbored desires. The noble who donated to the abbey may have sentenced a man to starvation behind stone. The cleaner the surface, the darker the stain beneath. And let's not forget the castle's construction itself. Every passage you walk through now is suspicious. Why is there a bricked-off doorway behind the grain store? Why does the cellar have a hollow-sounding wall? Why are there stairs that lead nowhere? Because castles weren't just built over generations, they were modified, rearranged, edited like a manuscript of power. New wings were added, old ones sealed off, rooms were swallowed by renovations, secrets preserved not by magic but by masonry. There's a story passed between servants about a woman named Isabeau. She was a noble's daughter, or maybe a rival's mistress. It changes with the teller. What's consistent is this: she disappeared, vanished without leaving the castle. No record, no witness. Some say she was murdered, others say she went mad and was walled up alive. The truth, no one knows. But the gap in the west stairwell, the one that echoes when you knock, feels like it could tell you, if it wanted to. Let's return to reality, shall we? You're summoned by the steward. He hands you a bucket and a cloth and sends you to the old chapel. Clean the benches, he says, and mind the corners. The rats are back. You obey. The old chapel is quieter than the main hall. Dust motes dance in shafts of pale light. The altar is cracked and a faded tapestry hangs limp behind it. Saint Denis holding his own severed head, comforting. You kneel and begin wiping the carved pews, but something draws your eyes to the floor. Near the altar, the stone is worn smooth, not like the rest, as if hundreds of feet have stood there, or knelt, or paced in distress. Behind the altar you find a tiny door, locked, but the hinges are rusted. You could pry it open with the handle of your broom. You hesitate, but only for a moment. Inside is a crawl space, and beyond that, a narrow spiral staircase that leads downward yet again. You descend, candle in hand. At the bottom is a circular room, damp and windowless. In its center, a stone basin. Not a font, not a tub, something else. Its rim is etched with symbols, crosses, skulls, Latin phrases you can't translate. There are rusted hooks on the wall, and bones in the corner. This wasn't a chapel, it was a rite chamber, possibly a private one for exorcisms. Maybe for confessions so severe the penance couldn't be witnessed. Or worse, a place where those accused of heresy were tested, dunked, starved, broken. And this is the part where you begin to feel the full weight of your position. Not just physically but philosophically. You're not just the lowest caste in a labor system. You are a witness to the machinery that sustains power through ritual and repression. You weren't meant to know this. You weren't meant to ask questions. You were meant to clean, bow and die. So you back away, slowly. You don't touch anything. You don't tell anyone. You carry the images in your head like scars, because now you know the castle is layered like a lie that was built, brick by brick, on silence. Let's wrap this in criticism. We love to think of castles as symbolic of heritage. We preserve them, tour them, sell weddings in their gardens. But how often do we remember that many of them were functioning prisons for the people who built them, that their wealth was extracted from suffering, that their mystique is often just sanitized brutality? The secret rooms are real, the torture chambers are real, the ghost stories may be metaphors but rooted in something grimly human. So the next time someone gasps, "Isn't it romantic?" while gazing at castle ruins in the mist, remind them the mist might be memory trying to forget. Chapter 5. Disease in the Upper Hall. By now the castle has revealed its true nature to you, not a sanctuary of knights and honor, but a grand stone lie powered by fear, silence and sweat. But if you thought that was the worst it could get, you've underestimated the most efficient killer of the medieval world, disease. You learn about it the way most castle servants do, by watching someone cough and waiting to see who drops next. It begins subtly. The youngest noble's son, Adrian, starts coughing in the morning while you're sweeping his chamber. At first it's light, phlegmy, but passable. By afternoon, it's a wet rattle, echoing from his throat like a drowning man gargling hot wine. He refuses to stop riding, refuses medicine, refuses to believe anything is wrong, because nobles, as always, are convinced they're immune to consequences. By nightfall, he's delirious. You're sent back to his chambers, told to refresh the linens and mind your eyes, which is ironic because there's nothing refreshing about what you walk into. He's slumped against his bedding, soaked in sweat. His tunic is clinging to him. His lips are cracked. His fingernails have gone a waxy blue. The room smells of bile, wet wool, and something worse, a metallic rot that sticks to the inside of your nose. This is more than a cold. This is a fever, and everyone knows what that means. You are given no gloves, no mask, no protection, just a cloth, a bucket of water, and vague instructions from a steward who looks paler than usual. You gently peel back the sheets to clean them, and see the sores on Adrian's torso, pustules, purple blotches. You recoil, but you dare not scream, because if you panic, you'll be punished, and if you run, you'll be suspected of spreading it. Let's zoom out. This was life in a medieval castle when illness hit, and it always hit. Castles were enclosed, poorly ventilated, and humid breeding grounds for every airborne and waterborne nightmare nature could engineer. They had no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, no quarantine protocols beyond locking someone in a room and waiting for the sounds to stop. You're ordered to dispose of Adrian's bedding in the courtyard fire, but before you can do that, the priest arrives. He wears a chain with a tiny wooden cross, and carries a vial of holy oil. He doesn't bring medicine, there isn't any. He doesn't bring advice, he's not trained. What he brings is comfort, which means murmuring Latin, crossing himself and suggesting the illness might be a punishment from God for vanity. Vanity. The boy is 17, dying in his bed, and the church is delivering poetic scorn in place of care. You meanwhile are now considered contaminated. You're not told this, of course, but servants start standing further from you. No one lets you serve at the noble table. You're told to sleep in the outer stables until the Lord decides. You aren't sick yet, but your proximity has made you untouchable. Funny how that works. Let's pause and break down the medieval disease toolkit, shall we? If you were noble and ill, you might be treated by a physician, a man educated in Latin, trained by outdated books, and likely convinced your bile was unbalanced. His treatment plan would include bloodletting, purging, induced vomiting, herbal poultices of questionable composition, leeches, and prayer, lots of it. If you were a servant, you got none of that. Your healer was an old woman with a knife and a bag of moss. If you lived, she was a miracle worker. If you died, they'd burn her as a witch. And yet the church preached that everyone was equal in death. That suffering cleansed the soul. That illness was divine judgment. Convenient, wasn't it? The rich got treated, the poor got sermons. Now back to Adrian. 2 days later, he dies, quietly, in the night. The steward tells the staff he passed with grace. What he means is, the boy soiled himself and choked on his own blood while the priest whispered last rites over a boy who could no longer hear. The castle doesn't, it never stops. The next morning, his room is cleared, his clothing is burned, his name is not spoken. You're told to air out the chamber, scrub the walls, and remove the basin. The basin, it's full of blood and bile. You carry it like a cursed relic down the spiral stairs and dump it in the moat. No one blinks. You ask what will happen to Adrian's body. He'll be taken to the crypt, they say, after supper, because yes, the Baron has decided the feast must continue. Here's your weekly sarcasm dose. Isn't it amazing how noble tragedy gets 20 minutes of attention and a ceremonial burial, while your friend Luke, the scullery boy who vanished last week after coughing blood, is simply forgotten? No grave, just a missing name, and a new face, brought up from the village. Disease was democracy's only real success in the Middle Ages. It did not care about your rank, but your death. That still followed hierarchy. Let's end with some bitter truth. Medieval castles were not safe. Not from invaders, not from betrayal, and certainly not from disease. Illness lived in the very walls, in the smoke that coated your lungs, in the stagnant moat, in the fleas on the dog that slept in the baron's hall. Castles were petri dishes, and the people inside, just samples. So the next time someone says, "I wish I lived in a castle," it must have been so clean and peaceful. Go ahead and offer them a job. Tell them they can start with handling a bucket of nobleman's bile and sleeping next to the stables while a priest debates whether they're sick or sinful. Let's see how peaceful they feel after that. The castle doesn't mourn. Adrian, the noble boy who died choking on his own blood, is now just another name etched into the chapel's cold stone wall. The priest mumbles a prayer. The steward instructs the staff to resume duties. The servants say nothing. You don't even get the day off. In fact, you get more work, because when the nobility grieves, they grieve with banquets.
Yes.
A feast to celebrate the soul, of course. Nothing says eternal salvation quite like roast pig and overspiced pies. While Adrian's corpse is being salted and boxed for crypt delivery, his family is demanding fresh linens and black lace for the widow's garb. You, naturally, are assigned to the laundry team, boiling cloth in scalding water and scrubbing at vomit stains with lye strong enough to blister your hands. Meanwhile, a rumor spreads. The stable boy has taken ill. A cough, a fever. The steward shrugs and says to keep him out of the kitchens. Just the kitchens. Not the sleeping quarters. Not the hallways. Not away from the other servants. Because he's replaceable. And as long as he doesn't die in front of the Baron's guests, it doesn't matter. Let's take a moment to appreciate how medieval castles handled outbreaks, which is to say, they didn't. There were no protocols, no contact tracing, no understanding that lice, fleas, or rats could spread anything but annoyance. A person would get sick, be isolated maybe, and everyone would pretend that was enough. And when 5 people got sick, still not enough evidence to act. Only when nobles began dying did the castle begin fumigating with burnt rosemary and waving incense around like that ever solved anything. But of course, they blamed someone. They always did. The first suspects were the Jews, if any lived nearby, or the midwives, or the old herbalist woman with the crooked back, who mumbled when she worked. She's accused of casting a wasting spell. You've seen her give salves that actually help, but she's dangerous now. Not because she's wrong, but because she's not dying fast enough. A bailiff is dispatched. She's taken to the local jail. If she's lucky, they'll forget about her. If not, she'll burn. You say nothing. You scrub harder. Let's pan back to the broader picture. Medical knowledge in 13th century France wasn't just limited. It was actively ignorant. Physicians were trained in old Greco-Roman theories that revolved around the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too sick, bleed them. Too cold, apply heat. Vomiting, purge more. These were the methods passed down, defended, and repeated for centuries, and they didn't work. Want to see a surgical kit from this era? Imagine a bone saw, some rusty hooks, and a cloth soaked in vinegar. That's if you were lucky enough to be treated. Most of the time you'd just be told to pray harder or make a pilgrimage. And yet, the most dangerous part wasn't the diseases themselves. It was how normal they had become. People died so often, so young, and so arbitrarily that most peasants didn't even flinch when someone coughed up blood. A child dies, God's will. A servant collapses in the courtyard, overwork. A rash spreads across 3 floors of the castle. A test of faith. Faith, that word again. A shield for inaction, a salve for abuse. Meanwhile, back in your part of the castle, the fever is spreading. 2 kitchen boys are missing. A chambermaid vomited while folding linens and was told to finish the set before resting. You're moved to sleep in the hayloft to make room for the newest patient, the Baron's cousin, who has arrived with a mysterious cough and a retinue of 12 perfectly healthy attendants. You share the loft with Pierre, who was once the strongest of the kitchen lads. Now he lies curled under a tattered cloak, shivering violently. His face is pale. His breath smells like rotting apples. He was cheerful last week. Now he mutters to himself and calls for his mother. You try to comfort him, but he flinches. He doesn't recognize you anymore. Let's talk about how corpses were handled. If you were noble, your body was anointed, wrapped, and placed in the family crypt. There were candles, masses, even songs. If you were a servant, you were tossed in the ground near the stables, or worse, burned quietly in the woods to avoid suspicion. No prayers, no names, just smoke in the trees and a missing breakfast lad. And you knew it was coming when they handed you a shovel. No words, just a nod toward the tree line. By now you've started coughing too. You tell yourself it's just the smoke, or the damp air, or the mildew from the ruined tapestries you cleaned last week. But the truth lingers in your chest like a stone. You're sweating more. You haven't eaten in days. And when you bend down to light the oven, the world spins. No one notices. No one asks. No one ever does. Let's end with a final slap of historical honesty. Castles were not places of safety. They were places of containment. When disease entered, it rarely left without taking half the staff with it. And it wasn't just the Black Death, it was the sweating sickness, dysentery, consumption, poxes, both great and small. Disease was the invisible master of the castle, the one nobody named, but everyone served. And yet, we romanticize this. We decorate nurseries in castle themes. We sell wedding packages in ancient halls where people died coughing in corners. We pretend these places were magical. But magic doesn't leave blood in the bedding, and fairy tales don't end with 5 shallow graves and a priest who says God has his reasons. So the next time someone calls the medieval castle a symbol of glory, ask them if they're ready to sleep next to a fevered servant in a straw loft with no medicine, no hope, and no one coming to check if they're still breathing. Because glory doesn't knock before it takes you, and neither does plague.
Chapter 6. The Iron Court of Justice. There's a whisper that floats through the kitchens early that morning. It arrives between ladle swings and the squawk of a goose being plucked for dinner. One of the servants, a soft-footed boy named Lewis, has been accused of theft. No one knows what, exactly. A spoon, a silk sash, a crust of bread. It hardly matters. What matters is that someone above noticed something missing, and someone below needs to be blamed. That someone is always one of you. By noon, Lewis is gone. You see him escorted through the main courtyard, flanked by 2 guards. He's shaking, his mouth opens to protest, but the steward slaps him silent. His hands are bound with rope, not too tight, just tight enough to humiliate. And you know what comes next. Justice, medieval style. Let's not pretend the Middle Ages were unaware of law. Feudal France had laws. Lots of them. Pages of codes, declarations, and customs passed down orally and in writing. But justice in the castle wasn't based on logic or evidence. It was based on hierarchy and theatre, and the stage for this performance, the Great Hall. That afternoon, you're told to clean the rushes and polish the tableware. The nobles want everything gleaming, because justice, like a feast, must be presentable. You work alongside others in silence, each of you glancing up at the throne-like chair where the Baron sits in judgment. It's just another day, another trial, another lesson for the staff. When Lewis is brought in, he's forced to kneel. He looks like a cornered animal. His tunic is dirty, his face pale. The Baron frowns theatrically. He speaks slowly, deliberately, as if quoting scripture. This boy has broken the trust of this house, and for that, we seek truth by fire. Wait, fire. Yes. Because evidence is optional. In castles like this, truth wasn't uncovered through investigation. It was extracted through ordeals. Let's dive into this terrifying concept. In medieval legal thinking, God would not allow the innocent to suffer unjustly. Therefore, trials often involved pain, with the logic that divine intervention would protect the blameless. There were 3 main flavors: trial by fire, holding hot iron or walking over coals. If your burns healed cleanly, you were innocent. Trial by water, you'd be dunked in a river, sink, innocent. Float, guilty and possibly possessed. Trial by combat, if you could fight your accuser and win. God clearly favored you. These weren't medieval metaphors. These were official procedures. Back to Lewis. The steward brings out the tools. A small iron rod, heated red hot in the hearth. Lewis is to carry it 5 paces, while chanting a prayer. Then his hand will be wrapped in linen for 3 days. If the wound heals cleanly, he's innocent. If it festers, he's guilty and punished accordingly. You watch as they press the glowing metal into his palm. The scream he makes is inhuman. His knees buckle, he collapses onto the floor, convulsing. The steward lifts him roughly, shoves a cloth in his mouth, and bandages the hand. The nobles clap once, politely. Justice has been served. Let's stop and criticize, shall we? We talk about justice today as if it's flawed, and it is. But medieval justice wasn't just flawed, it was designed for failure. It wasn't about finding truth, it was about reinforcing control, about keeping people afraid. The goal wasn't fairness,
it was order, even if that meant branding a child a thief for losing a napkin. Punishment didn't stop with trials either. There were gibbets, iron cages hung from towers where criminals were left to rot as a warning, stocks and pillories, where villagers pelted you with garbage, whippings in the courtyard, often to entertain guests. One misplaced bowl and you might be tied to a post while children laughed and threw dung at your head. And torture? Yes, that too. Officially, torture was discouraged. Unofficially, it was routine. A thief might have his fingers crushed. A liar might have his tongue pierced. A servant who lied about a noble, boiled in oil. You think I'm exaggerating, but documents survive detailing such sentences passed in rural France as late as the 14th century, not just in times of war, but in times of peace. You once heard of a kitchen girl named Jeanne. She was caught whispering that the lady of the house had a bastard child. The steward dragged her out by the hair. She was flogged, then exiled from the grounds. Last anyone saw of her, she was begging in the village square, one eye swollen shut. Her only crime, knowing too much. Let's get back to Louis. 3 days later, the bandage is removed. The wound is infected. His fingers are purple. The steward declares the verdict. Guilty. God has spoken. Louis C. begs for mercy, but mercy isn't part of the castle's economy. His punishment, branding. A hot iron to the shoulder, marking him for life. A thief, untouchable. No other lord will hire him now. No village will feed him. He's banished, broken, and barefoot. You want to speak up, but you know the rules. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as intended. And here's the kicker. These performances of justice weren't hidden. They were spectacles, attended by guests, written into records, sometimes even turned into poetry. The Baron who purged his house of thieves, a story told not to remember pain, but to celebrate control. Now let's talk about revenge. If you're wronged, there's no court to hear your plea, no lawyer, no appeal. If a noble steals from you, you say nothing. If your sister is assaulted by a steward, you say nothing, because if you speak, you become the threat, and threats are eliminated. So you keep your head down, you keep your mouth shut, you survive. Let's close with some historical clarity. Castles didn't uphold justice. They created rituals of pain to remind everyone where they stood, the nobles at the top, the servants at the bottom, and God conveniently always on the side of those with land and titles. And the irony, the same walls that sheltered nights and prayers also echoed with screams and judgment. And while we tour them today with audio guides and selfie sticks, those stones remember. They always remember. So next time someone calls medieval justice simple but fair, hand them a glowing iron rod and ask them to walk 5 paces. Let's see how fair they feel after that. Louis is gone now, his branded shoulder wrapped in a rag, his figure disappearing through the outer gates, destined for a life on the fringes. No fanfare, no restitution, just silence, broken only by the sound of the portcullis groaning shut behind him. And you, like every other servant who witnessed the trial, are left with a new and unspoken instruction: don't ever make yourself visible. The great hall is cleaned, the iron is cooled, the nobles return to their meat and wine. The ordeal in their minds is concluded, but for you, it lingers, burns, even, because now, every slip of the tongue, every missing tool, every misunderstood glance is a potential death sentence, wrapped in ceremony. And what makes it worse is that this wasn't an anomaly, this was the norm. Let's explore a few more tools in the castle's justice arsenal. You've already seen the ordeal by fire, but did you know some lords kept a breaking wheel? Yes, a wooden wheel upon which serious criminals were tied and beaten with iron rods, limbs shattered, bodies left on display as deterrent. It was rare, but real, and when it wasn't the wheel, it was the ducking stool. Accused of witchcraft, way more than a loaf of bread. Congratulations, into the freezing river you go. The beauty of these punishments, at least from the noble perspective, was that they were public theatre. They reinforced a lesson that suffering was earned, and mercy was optional. Especially when the crowd cheered, and crowds did cheer, because after a while, pain becomes entertainment. For the villagers watching from outside the castle walls, a whipping or branding was a spectacle, a rare moment of excitement in lives usually filled with drudgery. You, the castle servant, couldn't cheer, but you watched. Everyone watched, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. Let's not forget the stocks, those wooden frames where your head and hands were locked in place in the public square. Your crime could be anything from theft to speaking rudely about a noble. You'd be left there for hours, days, even, exposed to the weather, to rats, to ridicule. People threw spoiled food at you, sometimes stones, sometimes worse. You remember Clarice, a washer girl. She laughed once when a noble's horse slipped in mud. A steward heard her. The next morning she was in the stocks, day and night. No cloak, no shoes. She was 16, and yet, no one helped her. Not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't afford to. Because helping someone in pain marked you as a sympathizer, and sympathizers were often This is what makes the castle's justice so insidious. It didn't just punish it isolated. It divided the weak from each other. It made you think twice about kindness. It turned fear into policy. And let's talk about who never faced this justice. The steward who regularly stole wine from the cellar, untouched. The knight who struck a page boy in a drunken rage, applauded for his discipline. The priest who took tithes and used them to buy imported saffron for his stew, revered as holy. The laws, you see, were not designed for the powerful. They were designed to keep the powerless compliant. Now let's turn the cruelty dial slightly further. In some castles there was a tradition called the Court of Misrule. Once a year, during certain feasts or festivals, the servants were allowed to mock the lords, play acting as nobles, switching roles for a day. It sounds fun, right? A bit of harmless rebellion. But here's the catch. It wasn't safe. Say something too pointed. Mock the wrong lord's limp. Accuse a real sin through joke. The following morning you'd be punished for it. This so-called freedom was a trap. A test of loyalty disguised as celebration. A reminder that your place could be temporarily mocked, but never truly escaped. And what about false accusations? In a world without surveillance, paper trails, or due process, all it took was a single noble's word to end you. Perhaps the lady of the house didn't like how you stared at her. Maybe the cook thought you were trying to usurp his authority. Or maybe a noble's child needed a scapegoat for breaking a valuable dish. You had no voice, no defense. Your silence, your obedience, and your invisibility were your only protection, and even those could fail. Let's pivot to the castle's dungeon, often romanticized in stories as the domain of hooded executioners and brave prisoners. But in truth, it was worse than the tales. Most dungeons were damp, unlit chambers carved into the rock below the keep. There were no cells, just pits, chains, and rats. You weren't fed unless someone remembered. You weren't tried unless someone was bored enough to hold a hearing. You were forgotten, buried in noise, in cold, in darkness. A living death. The worst part, no one outside would ever know. Castles were fortresses of controlled narrative. Everything that happened within its walls was curated, by priests, by stewards, by nobles. Records were kept when they were flattering, not when they were honest. So what are you left with? A justice system that punished the innocent, excused the guilty, and kept everyone afraid enough to obey. A castle where pain was currency, truth was optional, and mercy was performance art. Let's end with a bite of historical critique. When we visit castles today, we marvel at their architecture, their battlements, their stained glass. But rarely do we ask who bled to make those stones shine. Rarely do we ask how many lives were broken behind the noble code. Justice in these halls was never blind. It was selectively blindfolded. So the next time someone says medieval people were simpler, more honorable, look them in the eyes and say, tell that to the branded boy who lost a hand for stealing bread, while the baron rode by on a horse he didn't pay for.
Chapter 7. Underground Dungeons of Hunger. The air gets colder the deeper you go, not the crisp cold of a mountain breeze, but a damp, lung-souring chill that clings to your bones and smells faintly of old iron, mildew and fear. You've never been this far below the castle before. Few servants have, and those who have rarely talk about it. But now it's your turn. The steward says they're short on men, and someone needs to deliver the daily ration to the dungeon. That someone is you. You're handed a wooden tray. On it sits a crust of black bread, a small pitcher of brackish water, and a bowl of cold pottage that smells like wet hay and onions. This, they say, is food for 2 prisoners. You're warned not to speak, not to look too long, and above all, not to ask questions. The staircase down is so narrow you have to twist sideways. The torch in your hand sputters, casting crooked shadows on the stone. The walls sweat. You think you hear dripping, but you're not sure if it's water or something else. And then a thick slab of oak, reinforced with metal bands, and a lock that looks more like a weapon than a tool. You knock once, the way the steward showed you. The jailer opens it slowly. He doesn't greet you, just stares. One eye clouded over, lips dry and cracked. He takes the tray without thanks, nods, then steps aside. You follow because he's waiting, and you're afraid not to. The dungeon is a single chamber. No windows, no airflow, just rock and rot. Chains hang from the walls.
some broken, some still in use. One prisoner, a man, maybe 40, maybe 60. It's hard to tell, sits slumped against the far wall. His wrists are raw. His tunic is more patch than cloth. He doesn't speak. He doesn't even lift his head. The other, a boy, no older than you, shackled at the ankles, coughing, thin as kindling. The jailer places the tray between them and walks away. Neither moves toward the food. You suspect they no longer care. Welcome to medieval incarceration. You see, castles didn't keep dungeons for long-term reform. They weren't trying to rehabilitate. There were no scribes, no appeals, no idea of redemption. You weren't sent here to wait for trial. You were sent here to disappear. Let's be clear about one thing. Most medieval dungeons weren't rooms. They were holes. Literally, some were just pits carved into the rock, accessed by rope or ladder. Others were beneath the castle's keep or tower, so-called oubliettes, from the French oublier, meaning to forget. Once you were dropped in, you were meant to be erased. And food. If you were lucky, you got one meal a day. More often, you were fed at the whim of the jailer, who by the way was not paid regularly, and often compensated himself with bribes. If you had no family sending coins, you starved, slowly, quietly, conveniently. Now let's talk conditions. There are no beds, you sleep on stone. There are no toilets. You relieve yourself in the corner, or in your clothes, or not at all. There is no light, only what the jailer brings. You lose track of time within hours. Within days you begin to hallucinate. The rats nibble at your fingers while you sleep. The damp causes your skin to split. Your wounds fester. Your teeth loosen. And still, no one checks on you. Unless someone above remembers you, which they usually don't. Back to your reality. You stand frozen as the jailer turns back to you. Well, he grunts. Are you staying or going to gawk? You mumble an apology and step back toward the door. As you pass the tray, the boy reaches a trembling hand toward the pottage. The older man doesn't move. You wonder what they did, but you know better than to ask. That's the thing about dungeons. They breed silence, not just below ground but above. No servant wants to speak of them. No noble wants to explain them. They are the castle's dark lungs, breathing fear into everyone who hears the chains rattle below. Let's discuss what got people thrown down here. It could be anything. Theft, disobedience, gossip, suspicion, sometimes nothing at all. A noble accuses you and down you go. You ask too many questions. Down. You defend someone who was wrongly accused. Double down. The very existence of the dungeon ensured obedience. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a threat. A warning whispered from guard to scullery maid. Careful, the dungeon's cold this time of year. And if you ever left, you didn't speak of it, because what could you say? That you were chained beside a man who wept for 3 days until he stopped making sounds entirely. That your skin still bears marks where the mold grew in your hairline. That you ate from a bowl still warm with someone else's blood. No, you kept that to yourself, or you were sent back down. Let's not forget the jailer's role in all this. He's not a monster, he's a function, just like the ladle or the broom. He has no authority, only the power to make you, and he uses it because pain maintains order. His world is simple. Obey the steward, ignore the screams, collect your coin and avoid eye contact with the dying. And the worst part, he sleeps better than you do. Back in the castle's upper levels, a feast is being prepared. You smell roast garlic and duck fat wafting down the stairwell as you emerge from the depths. Nobles laugh in the hallway. A lady complains that her embroidery thread is too coarse. Somewhere, a dog barks with more dignity than the men shackled in the dark, and no one says a word. Because this is the rhythm of the castle. Celebration above, suffering below. Every torch you light hides a shadow. Every song you hear muffles a sob. Every toast to peace is built on the silence of those no longer able to speak. Let's end on a thought history often forgets. Medieval castles were never as romantic as we've made them. They were not just fortresses of stone, but of secrets. Their power didn't only come from high walls or armored knights. It came from fear. Deep, layered, institutional. The dungeon was its heart, and its heartbeat still echoes in the stone. So the next time someone sighs and says, "Wouldn't it be lovely to live in a castle?" smile politely, and ask them how long they think they'd last in the dark.
You make it up the stairs alive, that something has shifted. The light above feels sharper. Every voice feels louder. The warmth of the hearth, the clatter of kitchen knives, the scent of rising bread. All of it feels wrong, like it's playing too cheerfully over a grim soundtrack only you can hear. Because now you've seen what no servant is supposed to see. Not the secret passageways, not the priest's private chamber. No, you've seen the bottom. And once you've seen the bottom, you understand the purpose of everything above. You try to return to your work. You scrub a pan,
You peel onions, but your hands won't stop trembling. Each flicker of fire reminds you of the jailer's torchlight. Each heavy footstep above makes your neck tense. You listen more carefully now, not just to commands, but to the tone behind them. Because when you've been that close to forgotten souls, you realize how quickly anyone can become one. Later that day, the steward asks if you delivered the food. You nod. He says nothing. He doesn't want details, he wants compliance, and you give it to him. Because this is the unspoken law of the castle. What happens in the dungeon stays in the dungeon, mostly because those who leave it seldom talk, and those who talk seldom stay. Let's dive into the psychology of forgetting. In medieval castles, the dungeon wasn't just a punishment, it was an erasure mechanism, a tool not only to inflict pain, but to obliterate identity. You didn't just lose freedom, you lost context. No trial notes, no memorials, no record of arrest. The castle simply swallowed you like bad debt and moved on. But why? Because to maintain power, the nobility needed more than walls and weapons. They needed a system that eliminated witnesses. Pain wasn't just for the body, it was for the collective mind of the lower classes. The dungeon wasn't meant to house criminals, it was meant to produce obedience. You now see it everywhere. The noble lady's silken dress, woven by a seamstress, whose sister once vanished into the lower keep. The polished armor of the knight, coated in oil prepared by a blacksmith's apprentice who hasn't been seen in weeks. The cheerful bard's melody echoing off the walls, drowning out the sound of someone quietly weeping in the grain store because her cousin never came back from a dungeon errand. We don't talk about those people, we smile, we serve, because fear is the mortar that holds the castle together. You begin noticing small things. Scratches in stone corners, runes carved into window frames, marks from fingernails on servant hall doors, evidence of other hands, other moments, other breakdowns. You start to wonder how many others cracked before you, how many hid their shaking beneath aprons and ladles, pretending everything was fine. Now, let's talk logistics. Dungeons weren't just punishment sites, they were multi-purpose rooms of control. They stored hostages. Nobles might imprison rivals' family members to ensure cooperation, sometimes for years. These prisoners were not tortured, but neither were they allowed to live. They became shadows, walked twice a day for fresh air, then returned to a damp cell with one window the size of a rat hole. Dungeons also housed political liabilities, bastard children, unwanted heirs, servants who knew too much. A rumor, that's a trial. A truth, that's a lifetime sentence. No conviction, no parchment, just dust and chains. And then there were the mad. Madness, in the medieval world, was spiritual, a sign of demonic possession or moral failure. Those afflicted weren't cared for, they were hidden, sealed in side rooms, strapped to damp benches, and visited only when their cries disturbed the nobles above. You remember now, someone did scream a few nights ago. You thought it was a fox outside the wall. It wasn't. Let's look briefly at the economic function of fear. A terrified servant is an efficient servant. You wake earlier, you complain less, you scrub harder, you ask for nothing. The dungeon whispers from below, keeping discipline sharper than any sword. The steward never has to raise his voice. The mere mention of the door near the western stairwell is enough to silence a hallway. And the beauty of it all, the castle doesn't need to use it off. It only needs you to know it exists. Back in your sleeping quarters that night, you lie stiff on the straw. Every creak of the floorboards makes your breath catch. A mouse scurries past, and your stomach lurches. You dream of chains, of dripping wool, of a voice calling out your name and no one answering. The worst part, the other servants aren't disturbed, because they've all had that dream. But here's something no one tells you eventually: fear doesn't make you better. It just makes you quiet, and silence doesn't equal loyalty. It equals exhaustion. That's why servants grow old by 30. That's why a boy who laughed yesterday sits blank-eyed at supper. That's why the cook keeps muttering a prayer under his breath that no one taught him. The castle wins not by breaking your body but by breaking your hope. Let's finish with some honesty. Today, tourists visit castles and ask, where's the dungeon? They want a photo, a thrill, a selfie with iron bars and a plaque. They don't want to hear about men who starved to death for forgetting a cup, about women locked away for knowing Latin, about children too loud near the Lord's quarters. They want mystery, not memory. And the irony, the castle gives them exactly that. It scrubs its stones, it polishes its doors, it sells itself as legend, and buries what it was beneath centuries of curated silence. So the next time someone says, the dungeon must have been exciting, take a long breath, look them in the eyes and say, only if you weren't the one locked inside. Chapter 8. A Wedding or a War. There's a buzz in the castle this morning, not the kind that means danger, or disease, or another execution. No, this one is worse. A noble wedding. The baron's niece is to be wed. A union not of love, of course, but of land, titles, and strategic mating. The groom, a neighbouring lord's son, is rumoured to have a lazy eye and a fondness for poultry. You know this because 3 kitchen servants already whispered that he once brought a goose to confession. But none of that matters, because this isn't about the couple, this is about the event. And for you, it's war. The steward is shouting before sunrise. The entire servant hierarchy is restructured. The scullery boy becomes a runner. The runner becomes a sweeper. You, somehow, are assigned to floral duty, which is just a nicer way of saying, carry 50 pounds of wild thistles up 4 flights of stairs, and don't scratch the tapestries. There is no choice. There is no I'm tired. There is no but I was in the dungeon yesterday. This is a wedding, and weddings in the medieval castle were as much about flexing as they were about family. You don't host a small ceremony, you host a spectacle, a festival of arrogance, financed with grain that should have fed the staff and spices that cost more than your life is worth. Everything must be perfect, and if it isn't, someone gets whipped. Let's begin with decorations. You hang woven garlands across beams high enough to break your neck if you fall. You arrange dried herbs on benches to mask the smell of mildew. You polish pewter until your fingers ache. The steward inspects everything with the face of a man who hasn't smiled since the last peasant uprising. If the flowers wilt, if the cloth is stained, if a candle leans even slightly, you're at fault. Meanwhile, the guests arrive. They come in cloaks embroidered with gold thread on horses, groomed better than you've ever been. They smell like cloves and saffron, and not suffering. They're served honeyed wine within moments of arrival. You watch from a distance, hands raw, face dirty, a basket of rushes on your back. If you speak, you're scolded. If you're seen, you're scolded. You are to be both invisible and efficient, a paradox no one questions. Now let's discuss the feast. It requires an army to prepare, not just meals but choreography. The head cook organizes like a general. Dozens of dishes, boiled eels, pigeon pies, tarts filled with almond paste and pressed with the couple's initials. Entire animals roasted whole and redressed in their skins to appear alive on the platter. Every meal a magic trick, every plate a declaration of power. And guess who gets to carry them? You. Over stone floors, through narrow doorways, past drunk nobles swinging goblets with reckless cheer. You carry a tray so heavy your shoulder dislocates slightly every time you turn. And the worst part, you'll never taste a bite. You'll go to bed hungry, mouth watering from spices your tongue will never touch. During the feast, music plays, dancers swirl, someone juggles flaming sticks. A noble girl laughs so hard she falls backward off her chair. You are ordered to catch her wine goblet mid-air. You fail, you're slapped. The music doesn't stop. Meanwhile, the bride sits like a statue, painted, laced, smiling like her teeth are nailed in place. You glimpse her for a second and wonder if she's happy. Then you see her eyes. She's not. She's terrified, but she knows better than to say anything. After all, she's about to marry a man whose family just bought a new grain mill. Feelings aren't part of the contract. Now comes the rituals. The priest gives a sermon no one listens to. Guests snicker. Someone's already drunk. The couple is blessed, tied with a ribbon, then kissed awkwardly. Mechanically, the bride is led away for preparation, which involves being surrounded by giggling ladies in waiting, who whisper cruel things under the pretense of celebration. You're outside scrubbing a wine stain from the corridor floor because the page boy tripped again. Let's pause for context. Weddings in medieval castles weren't really about the people being married. They were political tools. A daughter married off to avoid war, a son married to gain a dowry. Every guest was a chess piece, every meal a performance, every gift a calculation, and you, dear servant, were part of the scenery. Sometimes, if the castle was particularly large or petty, you'd be expected to perform, sing, dance, deliver a witty toast. If you were good, you got a coin. If you weren't, you were ridiculed for entertainment. Either way, you were exhausted. Let's sprinkle in some bitter irony. While nobles feasted, servants fasted. The more extravagant the meal, the more likely the pantry ran dry for weeks after, because the castle's stores weren't bottomless. Those 100 courses of wedding day excess meant rationing for the next month, and when food ran low, the nobles bought more. You just went hungry, and if you think these weddings were rare, think again. Nobles married for land, for peace, for power. They remarried. They hosted weddings for cousins, nieces, and even favored squires, each one a burden for the staff, and each time it was the same. Smile, serve, stay silent. Let's end this segment with one more insult to your dignity. Later that night, long after the guests are passed out, the music faded, and the bride locked behind her chamber door. You are sent to clean the hall. You sweep bones, collect silverware, scrub wine from tapestries that will never smell the same. You're dragging a bucket of filthy water down the steps when the steward stops you. You missed a goblet, he says. You turn to reach for it, and he trips you. Just to remind you, even when love is being celebrated, you are nothing. Chapter 8. A Wedding or a War. There's a buzz in the castle this morning. Not the kind that means danger, or disease, or another execution. No, this one is worse. A noble wedding. The baron's niece is to be wed. A union not of love, of course, but of land, titles, and strategic mating. The groom, a neighbouring lord's son, is rumoured to have a lazy eye and a fondness for poultry. You know this because 3 kitchen servants already whispered that he once brought a goose to confession. But none of that matters, because this isn't about the couple. This is about the event. And for you, it's war. The steward is shouting before sunrise. The entire servant hierarchy is restructured. The scullery boy becomes a runner. The runner becomes a sweeper. You, somehow, are assigned to floral duty, which is just a nicer way of saying, carry 50 pounds of wild thistles up 4 flights of stairs, and don't scratch the tapestries. There is no choice. There is no I'm tired. There is no but I was in the dungeon yesterday. This is a wedding, and weddings in the medieval castle were as much about flexing as they were about family. You don't host a small ceremony. You host a spectacle, a festival of arrogance, financed with grain that should have fed the staff and spices that cost more than your life is worth. Everything must be perfect, and if it isn't, someone gets whipped. Let's begin with decorations. You hang woven garlands across beams high enough to break your neck if you fall. You arrange dried herbs on benches to mask the smell of mildew. You polish pewter until your fingers ache. The steward inspects everything with the face of a man who hasn't smiled since the last peasant uprising. If the flowers wilt, if the cloth is stained, if a candle leans even slightly, you're at fault. Meanwhile, the guests arrive. They come in cloaks embroidered with gold thread on horses, groomed better than you've ever been. They smell like cloves and saffron, and not suffering. They're served honeyed wine within moments of arrival. You watch from a distance, hands raw, face dirty, a basket of rushes on your back. If you speak, you're scolded. If you're seen, you're scolded. You are to be both invisible and efficient, a paradox no one questions. Now let's discuss the feast. It requires an army to prepare. Not just meals, but choreography. The head cook organizes like a general. Dozens of dishes, boiled eels, pigeon pies, tarts filled with almond paste, and pressed with the couple's initials. Entire animals roasted whole and redressed in their skins to appear alive on the platter. Every meal a magic trick. Every plate a declaration of power. And guess who gets to carry them? You. Over stone floors, through narrow doorways, past drunk nobles swinging goblets with reckless cheer. You carry a tray so heavy your shoulder dislocates slightly every time you turn. And the worst part, you'll never taste a bite. You'll go to bed hungry, mouth watering from spices your tongue will never touch. During the feast, music plays. Dancers swirl. Someone juggles flaming sticks. A noble girl laughs so hard she falls backward off her chair. You are ordered to catch her wine goblet mid-air. You fail. You're slapped. The music doesn't stop. Meanwhile, the bride sits like a statue, painted, laced, smiling like her teeth are nailed in place. You glimpse her for a second and wonder if she's happy. Then you see her eyes. She's not. She's terrified, but she knows better than to say anything. After all, she's about to marry a man whose family just bought a new grain mill. Feelings aren't part of the contract. Now comes the rituals. The priest gives a sermon no one listens to. Guests snicker. Someone's already drunk. The couple is blessed, tied with a ribbon, then kissed awkwardly. Mechanically, the bride is led away for preparation, which involves being surrounded by giggling ladies in waiting, who whisper cruel things under the pretense of celebration. You're outside scrubbing a wine stain from the corridor floor because the page boy tripped again. Let's pause for context. Weddings in medieval castles weren't really about the people being married. They were political tools. A daughter married off to avoid war. A son married to gain a dowry. Every guest was a chess piece. Every meal a performance. Every gift a calculation. And you, dear servant, were part of the scenery. Sometimes, if the castle was particularly large or petty, you'd be expected to perform, sing, dance, deliver a witty toast, If you were good, you got a coin. If you weren't, you were ridiculed for entertainment. Either way, you were exhausted. Let's sprinkle in some bitter irony. While nobles feasted, servants fasted. The more extravagant the meal, the more likely the pantry ran dry for weeks after, because the castle's stores weren't bottomless. Those 100 courses of wedding day excess meant rationing for the next month, and when food ran low, the nobles bought more. You just went hungry, and if you think these weddings were rare, think again. Nobles married for land, for peace, for power. They remarried. They hosted weddings for cousins, nieces, and even favored squires, each one a burden for the staff, and each time it was the same. Smile, serve, stay silent. Let's end this segment with one more insult to your dignity. Later that night, long after the guests are passed out, the music faded, and the bride locked behind her chamber door. You are sent to clean the hall. You sweep bones, collect silverware, scrub wine from tapestries that will never smell the same. You're dragging a bucket of filthy water down the steps when the steward stops you. You missed a goblet, he says. You turn to reach for it, and he trips you. Just to remind you, even when love is being celebrated, you are nothing.
Chapter 9. The Alchemist Room. The wedding has passed. The guests are gone. The bloodstains scrubbed. The bride now walks the hallways like a ghost in fine fabric, her smile stiff and quiet. And you are back to routine, which in this castle means unpredictable madness disguised as order. But this day is different. At dawn, the steward calls your name. That alone is strange. He usually just points and scowls. He tells you to bring a tray of supplies, charcoal, clean rags, and 3 unmarked bottles to the west tower, the highest point of the castle. You hesitate. That tower is rarely mentioned. You've never been sent there before. Don't look at anything, the steward says. Don't touch anything. Speak only if spoken to, which is medieval, for you're going to see something that shouldn't exist. You climb the tower's spiral staircase, breath heavy, wooden tray rattling with every step. The stone grows colder with altitude. At the top you reach a thick iron-bound door. It opens before you knock. The man inside does not look like the others. He is older than the Baron, but not hunched. His eyes are pale and sharp. His robe is stained with ash, oil, and something you suspect is blood. On the table beside him, beakers, flasks, glowing stones, powders in glass tubes. The air stings your nose, smells like vinegar, and something sweet rotting underneath. This is the alchemist. Let's take a historical breath. Alchemists were not quite scientists, not quite priests, and definitely not trusted. They were tolerated, barely, because nobles believed they might one day produce gold, immortality, or control over life itself. In reality, most were experimenting with metal, fire, herbs, and rudimentary chemistry. But in the Middle Ages, that made them practically sorcerers. They were often loners, kept in towers, funded with suspicion. You place the tray on the nearest table. The alchemist doesn't thank you. He stirs something that hisses in a bowl made of blackened bronze. Then, as if remembering you're there, he gestures for you to follow. You hesitate. He doesn't wait. You follow him into a smaller side chamber, and what you see makes your stomach turn. A small animal, what was once a cat maybe, lies on a slab. Its fur is patchy, one eye is missing, its mouth stitched shut. Around the room are dozens of jars, some filled with murky fluid, others with bones, feathers, mushrooms with teeth. A scroll lies half opened, filled with symbols that swim in your vision if you stare too long. The alchemist speaks. You see, the Baron pays me not for answers, but for hope. He smiles. It's not comforting. They want gold, they want medicine, but I've found something more permanent. You don't reply. You don't breathe too loudly. You just try to remain furniture. He asks if you've ever heard of homunculus. You shake your head. He laughs softly. It means little man, a life made from matter, not born, constructed. He holds up a vial of thick, dark liquid. This is its blood. You don't ask where it came from. Let's break the tension with some historical insight. Alchemy in medieval Europe was a chaotic blend of pseudoscience, mysticism, and danger. The goal was the philosopher's stone, something that could transform base metals into gold or grant eternal life. But along the way, alchemists discovered things that were inconvenient: acids, toxins, explosive reactions, and the horrifying realization that matter could mimic life under the right pressure. Most alchemists were viewed with suspicion by the church. Some were arrested for heresy, others vanished. A few were killed by their own experiments, but those who survived lived in shadows, protected by nobles who wanted miracles but not accountability. Back to the tower. The alchemist asks you to bring him fresh water from the well. Not just any water, moon water, he says. Drawn just before midnight,
still enough to hold reflection, still enough to trap memory. You nod like you understand. You don't. Before you leave, he places something in your hand, a coin, but not like any you've seen. It's heavier, worn, etched with symbols. He tells you, give this to no one, not unless you want to be seen. You don't ask what that means. You just bow and descend the stairs. You tell no one where you've been. Let's pause and reflect. Why would a castle grounded in tradition, God and warfare, tolerate someone like this? The answer is desperation. Nobles feared death, they feared plague, they feared losing power, and alchemists, no matter how untrustworthy, represented a chance, however slim, at controlling the uncontrollable. They were dangerous, but so were illness, rebellion, and foreign invaders. Better to have danger in a tower than knocking at the gate. You begin to notice signs of the alchemist's work elsewhere. Strange powders mixed into the cook's bread flour, bottles that arrive unmarked and vanish by morning. A pigeon found with green eyes and 4 toes on each foot. A blacksmith who swears he saw the alchemist walking barefoot through fire. The priest says nothing, but you notice he no longer blesses the tower. And you sleep with the coin beneath your straw mattress. Not because you trust the alchemist, but because you've seen enough now to know that in this castle, everything holy has a secret, and everything secret holds power. Let's close with some philosophical rot. The alchemist is not just a curiosity, he's a mirror and a reminder that knowledge without morality doesn't liberate, it isolates. He may discover how to mimic gold, but at what cost? And would anyone stop him if he succeeded? Because in this castle, power doesn't need to be understood to be obeyed. So the next time someone calls the medieval period an age of faith, tell them about the man in the tower conjuring monsters in the dark while the chapel bells ring above. You don't sleep that night. You lie awake, staring at the roof beams above your straw pallet. The strange coin rests beneath your tunic, pressing cold against your ribs. You keep thinking about that room, the smell of vinegar and blood, the stitched animal corpse, the way the alchemist's eyes look through you. Not like you were human, but like you were material. You're not the only one who's unsettled. The other servants avoid the West Tower even more than before. Someone mutters that it's cursed. Another says the alchemist speaks to things in jars. You don't deny it, you just say nothing. Because now you understand that tower is a place you enter changed and exit wrong. And in this castle, being wrong is sometimes more dangerous than being guilty. The steward summons you 2 days later. He says the alchemist has requested your hands again. That's the phrase they use, your hands. Not you, as if you're just a pair of limbs, not a person. You nod. You don't ask why. You carry the next bundle of firewood to the tower in silence. When you arrive, the alchemist is scrawling symbols on a parchment that curls at the edges from the heat of a nearby brazier. He gestures vaguely and you place the wood near the hearth. You try to leave, but he stops you. You stayed silent, he says. You blink. He nods. That's rare. He opens a drawer and shows you something, a stone. The size of a plum. Glassy and red. Not ruby, not garnet. Something more. Alive. It pulses faintly when it catches the torchlight. He says it's not a gem. He says it's a seed. You don't ask for what. Let's pause. What is this really? Alchemy was rooted in transformation, turning base into noble, corruption into purity. It wasn't just about gold, it was about symbolism, about rising from decay. Alchemists studied decay not to avoid it, but to understand how to reverse it. They burned corpses, ground bones into powder, distilled urine, fermented blood. They believed that if death had a formula, so did life. And here, in this forgotten tower, that belief has room to fester. The alchemist tells you he's close to dividing the living from the mortal. That phrase makes your stomach churn. He says death is an ingredient, not a conclusion. He asks if you've ever wondered what gives meat its color. You don't answer. He laughs. Most don't. He offers you a spoon of something, a green powder mixed into hot wine. You hesitate. He raises an eyebrow. For knowledge, he says. You shake your head. He sips it himself, winces, smiles. It tastes like truth. Let's be honest, this man is terrifying. But more terrifying is the fact that the Baron protects him, funds him. Why? Because the alchemist is the only person in the castle who makes the Baron feel powerful enough to cheat death. The priest offers salvation in the afterlife. The alchemist offers control in this one. And that's the real alchemy. Not turning metal into gold, but turning fear into dependency. The Baron doesn't care if the potions work. He cares that someone is trying, that someone can whisper the illusion of command over the unknowable. And meanwhile, servants like you, you're the materials. You're the ones who test the salves, who carry the bones, who dig for sulfur and haul herbs that burn the skin. You are not assistants, you are instruments. That night, after you descend the tower, you notice something odd, a cat with glowing eyes. watching from the rafters, the stable boy bleeding from the nose after smelling a potion bottle too long, a kitchen fire that burns green for a moment. No one sees it but you. You begin to wonder, is the alchemist failing or succeeding? Let's talk fear again. Fear of magic in medieval France wasn't uncommon, but what frightened people more than magic was knowing too much about it. Knowledge, after all, wasn't democratized. It was hoarded. Monks copied texts by candlelight. Scribes encoded treatises in Latin. Most people couldn't read, and those who could were discouraged from reading the wrong things. And alchemists? They read everything. They read Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Latin. They stitched together knowledge from Baghdad, Alexandria, and rural Bretagne. The church couldn't entirely control them. Nobles couldn't entirely understand them. So they were kept close and watched from a distance, prized but feared. You begin to suspect that the alchemist isn't just experimenting with matter. You think he's experimenting with souls. One day, he hands you a cloth and tells you to clean a table. You begin wiping, and something shifts beneath the cloth. You flinch, pull it back, and see a jawbone. Human, smooth, polished, carved with markings. He watches you carefully. You place the cloth back, continue cleaning. He says nothing, but the next morning a coin appears in your sleeping mat again. Different, lighter. This one has a hole in the center. No one saw him place it there. No one admits to seeing you leave the tower, yet people look at you differently now. A chambermaid crosses herself when you pass. The cook won't meet your eyes. The steward reminds you, keep your place. You're becoming something dangerous. A person with proximity to power that no one understands. Let's end with a bitter insight. The alchemist is not above the castle. He is a part of it. A symptom of its sickness. A mind allowed to grow in isolation, fueled by ambition and the blind desperation of those who fund him. And you're learning that the most dangerous thing in the medieval world isn't disease or punishment. It's knowledge without protection. So the next time someone calls medieval thinkers primitive, remind them that some were trying to raise life from ash while the rest of the world was too afraid to look. And ask them, what's more terrifying, failure or success? Chapter 10. The Healer's Lies. Today the castle smells different. Not of roasting meat or tallow smoke, or musty stone. Today the halls reek of vinegar, sage, and something metallic, like rusted coins, soaking in old soup. You know what that means. Someone is sick. The whispers start near the well. The stablemaster's wife took to bed and didn't rise. Her hands were cold. Her feet turned dark. No one says the word. No one has to. In a castle, sickness isn't just a physical threat. It's a social collapse waiting to happen. You're ordered to fetch water for the castle's physician. Yes, that's what they call him. A man with 6 books, a crooked nose, and a robe that hasn't seen soap since your birth. He wears rings on every finger, none of them clean, and carries a pouch of dried herbs he insists can cure imbalance of the humours. You knock once on the infirmary door and step into a room of contradictions. The healer's chamber is part apothecary, part storage, part torture chamber. Dried roots hang from ceiling beams. Animal skulls line the shelves. A cauldron bubbles with something thick and green. In the corner, a boy moans quietly, arm wrapped in a bandage that's already begun to rot. The physician doesn't look up. The fever returns, he says flatly. You don't ask whose, you just nod. Let's get real for a moment. Medieval medicine was less about science and more about guesswork. With authority, the human body was believed to be ruled by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of one, you were sick. Solution: bleed the patient, burn some herbs, or strap a leech to the armpit and pray. The physician opens a dusty tome, fingers trembling as he traces a chart showing the proper phlebotomy points for balancing bile. He mutters, too much heat in the liver must be bled behind the knee. You blink. That's not a joke. That's the treatment. He sends you to boil the lancets. You comply, even though you know it's a performance. There's no sterilization. The iron is rinsed, not cleaned. The towels reused. The basin rarely emptied. The healer insists on repeating the phrase, purge the excess, return the balance. It sounds wise, but what it really means is let's see if he survives the bleeding. You watch as he slices a man's leg open with the precision of a drunken cook. Blood trickles, then pours. The patient groans. The healer watches like a hawk. Good, he says. The spirit is strong. Translation: he hasn't passed out yet. When the bleeding stops, he wraps the leg with linen soaked in wine, because wine is cleansing. At least that's what the books say. And the books, as you've noticed, were written by monks who died before age 40. Later, A priest arrives. He sprinkles holy water and mutters Latin. You think it's a blessing. It's actually a diagnosis. Sin, he says. The pestilence is drawn to impurity. So now the patient isn't just ill, he's guilty. You are ordered to clean the floors. You notice a girl sitting in the corner barefoot, pale, silent. No one tends to her. She's just waiting. You wonder if she's next or already forgotten. Let's drop in a bitter truth. Being sick in a castle wasn't just dangerous. It was shameful. It made you a burden. You stopped producing. You used up herbs. You slowed the kitchen. And so, those too sick to recover quickly were moved to the edge of usefulness, sometimes to the lowest floor, sometimes out the gate. Often they were told to rest near the herb garden, a nice way of saying die where the stink won't linger. You see it firsthand, the boy with the rotting bandage. He's gone by nightfall, no burial, just gone. Let's talk treatments. If you had a fever, you were bled. If you had chills, they burned rosemary and waved it near your face. If you had chest pain, they cupped your skin with hot glass. If you had sores, they smeared you with butter, crushed pearls, or chicken fat. If you were hallucinating, must be demons, get the priest. And yet this mess was considered advanced. Why? Because peasants outside the castle didn't even get this. They were fed onion soup and prayed over. Nobles, at least, had a room full of dried moss and scorpion powder. One afternoon, you're called to assist with a serious case. A knight who returned from a campaign has pustules along his neck. The healer examines him, sniffs once and declares, "Venom of the moon." He prescribes crushed beetles and powdered bone. You know what it is. Everyone does. It's plague. But no one says the word, because naming a sickness gives it teeth. The healer claims it's caused by corrupted air. He burns sulfur in a dish until the smoke chokes the room. Breathe deeply, he says. It cleanses the lungs. The knight vomits. The healer nods. The humors are resisting. You wipe the floor with a cloth so thin it disintegrates. Now let's break your heart. You find a small jar tucked in the corner. Inside is a finger, a child's, preserved in honey, labeled for fever. You don't ask, you just back away. You begin to understand the healer is not a liar. He believes in what he's doing, and that is far more terrifying. Because blind faith in broken systems keeps the wheel turning, keeps the sick bleeding, keeps the dead blamed, and keeps people like you scrubbing floors in rooms that reek of false hope and old blood. That night a woman dies screaming. No one answers her. The priest has gone to supper. The healer is asleep. You place a blanket over her face and whisper, "I'm sorry." You don't know why. It just feels necessary. Because in a place like this, where illness is considered moral failure, even kindness becomes an act of rebellion. You rise the next morning still haunted by the woman's final screams. The infirmary feels colder today. Not just in temperature, but in spirit. Something has shifted. The healer's apprentice, a boy barely 13, avoids eye contact. The stone floor where the woman died has already been scrubbed with vinegar and sage ash, as if a good smell could erase guilt. But guilt, like fever, lingers. The steward arrives, looking unusually pale. A knight's son, no more than 10, has developed the swellings. You don't need a chart to know what that means. Everyone in the castle has heard of the swellings. The bulging lumps that bloom like angry fruit beneath the skin, often around the neck or armpits, followed by fever, vomiting, and death. And yet, no one calls it plague. Instead, it's labeled God's breath, or the black boils. Euphemisms help people pretend they're safe, that this is manageable, exceptional, containable. Spoiler, it isn't. The healer insists on preparing a purge, a concoction of goat bile, nettle, ground coal, and a splash of fermented wine. It smells like rot, dipped in vinegar. You're told to spoon feed it to the child. The boy gags, coughs, and begins to sweat. The healer beams. See? The toxins resist. You want to scream. He's dying, not resisting. But you stay silent, because speaking out, even gently, would make you next on the table. The boy is dead by nightfall. The priest arrives after, waving incense and quoting scripture. The same old lines. The Lord gives, the Lord takes. He tells the grieving father, it's not illness, it's penance. A family sin must be repaid. Maybe the child lied, or maybe the mother once sinned in thought. Yes, medieval healthcare came with a side of blame. The priest says they must fast for 7 days, and donates salted meat to the monastery. The father nods, broken. The mother doesn't speak. She just weeps quietly, while folding her son's last shirt. Let's step back and dissect the full absurdity of this system. In a medieval castle, the line between physician, priest, and executioner was paper thin. Illness wasn't just a medical condition, it was political, spiritual, social. A noble sick with fever was mourned, a servant sick with cough was dismissed, a peasant sick with sores was banished. And the remedies? Well, if you were lucky, you got urine tested by color and consistency. Yellow, liver imbalance. Red, too much blood. Cloudy, definitely demon. If you were really unlucky, you got bled at both wrists and behind the ears. Leeched, poulticed with frog paste, then wrapped in a linen soaked in butter, honey and horseradish, because the heat must be drawn out. These weren't jokes, they were protocol. Let's talk death now, real, rotting, castle wall death. The boy's body isn't buried right away. Why? Because the gravedigger has 2 others to bury first, and the priest insists the ground must be blessed again. So the corpse waits, wrapped in a wool sheet, near the chapel. You're asked to stand guard so dogs don't get to it. Yes, that's part of your duty now, corpse guard. At one point, the steward walks by and tosses you a crust of bread. For the smell, he says. You assume he means to block your nose, but he winks. You realize he meant you should eat, even while guarding a dead child. Let that settle. You are a disposable cog in a castle that celebrates weddings with golden cups and guards its sick with vinegar-soaked rags and gaslighting. The healer walks past the body later, muttering something in Latin. He tells the priest, "We need more mandrake." The priest nods solemnly, as if that will resurrect the boy. They won't say plague, but the signs are everywhere now. A kitchen maid collapses. A falconer vomits blood in the stables. The cook stops singing. He doubles the incense burned in the chapel, and orders no one speak of illness aloud. He says, fear is the disease. Easy for him to say. He drinks imported wine, and hasn't shared a meal with the rest of the castle in 2 months. The healer is given more resources. More assistance. You notice him now experimenting with stranger remedies. Boiling mold from stale bread, mixing it with pig's blood. It's messy, it's useless. But he says he's close to finding a pattern. You begin to think he might believe that. Or worse, he might enjoy the process. One afternoon, he asks you to collect frogs from the castle moat. Their bellies hold the key to balance, he claims. You go partly because you fear punishment, and partly because anything is better than cleaning pus from open wounds. You return with 7 frogs. He slits one open, pokes the liver, frowns, and mutters something about moon position. Another is dried over fire and crumbled into ash. That ash is later rubbed into the gums of a coughing soldier. The soldier dies within an hour. The healer says it was too late to and no one questions him. Why? Because he's all they've got. Let's pause for some historical clarity. The idea of questioning the physician was rare. Authority flowed from robes, books and vocabulary. If he quoted Galen, Hippocrates, or Avicenna, even incorrectly, he was above reproach. And even when he failed, it was the stars, the sinners or the patient's own bile that got blamed. You were never allowed to ask if the healer caused more harm than help, but you do wonder, quietly, secretly, because you've seen more death this week than you can stomach. And every cure seems to end the same way. A new body to carry, a new floor to scrub. One night, you walk past the infirmary and stop. You see the healer asleep at his desk, face down in a pile of open scrolls. A candle flickers beside him. On the floor, an open book shows a drawing. 2 bodies, one dissected, one whole joined by a serpent. Below it, a phrase in faded ink, vita ex corruptionem, life from decay. You step away quiet, because in a castle where sickness is seen as divine judgment, the real disease isn't what's in the blood, it's what's in the beliefs. Chapter 11. The trial before the rope. You hear shouting before the bell rings. Not the usual chaos of spilled grain, or someone dropping a chamber pot out the window. This is deeper, heavier. Someone is begging. You pause at the stairwell. The steward and 2 guards are dragging a man across the great hall. You recognize him. Garin, the scullery assistant. Harmless, dull-eyed. Spent most of his days rinsing wooden bowls and humming off-key songs. Now he's weeping, sputtering, shouting, "I never touched the meat. I swear it. Ask anyone." You don't need the rest of the story to know where this is headed. In a medieval castle, truth doesn't matter. Perception is everything. If someone of importance claims you're guilty, then you are. The trial? It's just a formality dressed in ritual. And now Garin, poor fool, is the next offering to the gods of paranoia and order. Let's examine the reason. A nobleman fell ill last night, violently, vomiting, shivering, convulsing. His wife claims she saw Garin lurking near the kitchen fire, acting odd. That's it. That's the charge, acting odd. And in a system where hierarchy is law, that's all it takes. The Baron convenes the castle court, which sounds grand, but is essentially a handful of bearded men with swollen knuckles and old vendettas. The judge is the Baron himself, or occasionally the steward if the Baron's drinking. The evidence is testimony from those who fear punishment more than perjury. You watch as Garin is thrown into the center of the great hall. He's chained at the wrists. His tunic is torn. The guards step back like he might spit fire. The Baron sits above him on a raised dais. He doesn't look angry. He looks bored. Speak, he says. And Garin does. Through tears he explains he wasn't anywhere near the nobleman's food, that he's never even seen saffron, much less touched it, that he's been in the scullery for 7 years and never once been accused. But his voice cracks, his knees shake, and in this room weakness is proof. Let's talk about medieval justice. It wasn't blind, it was selectively blindfolded, usually toward the poor. There were no lawyers, no recorded precedents, no assumption of innocence. The accused stood alone, often illiterate, often trembling, before a room of men who wanted the session done before lunch. Trials might involve ordeals, walking across hot irons barefoot, holding a red-hot poker for a full minute, being submerged in water to see if God lets you float. If you do, you're a witch. If you survived, innocent, but severely burned or nearly drowned. If you didn't, well, you're dead, but at least now they're satisfied. Back to Garin. The cook is called to testify. He hesitates, then says Garin sometimes works near the stew. The steward nods. A soldier claims he once saw Garin sneeze without crossing himself. The priest frowns. The healer says nothing, just scribbles on a scroll. You suspect it's not even related. It's all stacking up. You want to shout that Garin is harmless, that this is absurd, but you don't, because speaking up means inviting suspicion, and suspicion is a disease with no cure in this place. Let's explore the deeper rot why these spectacles are necessary. Castles are isolated ecosystems. Rumors spread like plague. One case of perceived poisoning. Suddenly every servant is suspect. Fear creates obedience, and public punishment becomes preventative theatre. The Baron needs to reassert control, especially now with sickness, shortages and whispers of unrest. Garin isn't being judged for his actions. He's being sacrificed for stability. And here's the worst part. Garin knows it. You see it in his eyes as the sentence is passed. 3 days in the stocks followed by cleansing in the moat. It sounds gentle. It is. The stocks are not just wooden devices. They're humiliation machines. The scullery boy who once washed your bowl will now sit in filth, exposed to wind, flies and passing kicks from anyone having a bad day. The cleansing, that's the moat. A fetid stew of sewage and dead frogs. It's less purification, more biological warfare. Garin doesn't protest. He just sobs, and the Baron moves on to his next matter, adjusting grain rations. Let's talk about the court's efficiency. Punishment is fast because investigation is slow. There's no detective, no examination of motive, no concern about fairness. The point is to demonstrate power. Justice here isn't about finding truth. It's about making sure everyone else falls in line. You notice a kitchen maid whisper, "He shouldn't have spoken out last week." Ah, there it is. Last week, Garin complained the meat smelled foul, said the barrels of salted pork were too warm. Someone overheard, maybe a knight, maybe the steward, maybe the meat supplier. And now Garin is a cautionary tale. After the trial you pass by the stock. Garin is already locked in. His head droops. Children throw pebbles. A noble's hound urinates on the ground nearby. You pause, hesitate, then slide a piece of bread into his hand. He doesn't look up. He just whispers, "Thank you." It's the only mercy he'll get. And you walk away faster than usual, because in this castle, being kind is dangerous. Let's end this segment with clarity. Trials in medieval castles were rarely about guilt. They were about spectacle, about channeling fear into order, about punishing inconvenience and rewarding compliance, about reminding everyone who owns the air they breathe. So the next time someone romanticizes honor and chivalry, tell them about the scullery boy who was sentenced for sneezing, and ask, was the Middle Ages really about virtue or just very creative cruelty? By the second morning of Garin's punishment, the castle has moved on. The grain carts have arrived from the lower farms. A mason has fallen from the northern turret scaffolding. The steward, is busy calculating flour to crumb ratios, and Garin, still in the stocks, head slumped forward, his feet swollen. One of his cheeks is purple from a thrown apple. The moat cleansing is tomorrow. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows he won't survive it. You hear the younger servants whisper in the corridor. They say he cursed the food. They say he speaks to frogs. They say he walks in his sleep and mumbles Latin. It's incredible how fast a man turns from scullery hand to folk demon, but that's medieval psychology in motion. Fear finds relief through invention, and the castle, ever hungry for order, feeds on these lies like mold feeds on bread. You ask the kitchen maid, softly, "Do you think he did it?" She shrugs. "Don't matter, do it. He's already done for." That's justice. Medieval edition. Not about whether someone committed a crime, only whether the punishment feels satisfying enough to end the tension. Let's talk about tension. Castle life was built on silence. Orders were taken, not questioned. Suspicion could be fatal, and no matter your rank, knight, cook or chambermaid, you were always one misstep from accusation. Wrong look, wrong word, wrong time, but some were especially vulnerable. Foreigners, the slow-minded, the overly devout, and worst of all, the clever. You see, cleverness without power was dangerous. The educated poor were threats. A servant who read too well or spoke too precisely became suspect. Why? Because in a world run by tradition and superstition, the unfamiliar mind became a target. Now let's examine what happens after a punishment. Does the baron feel remorse? Do the priests hold a vigil? Do the other servants show sympathy? No, they do what medieval systems always demanded: pretend it never happened. By the time Garin is cut from the stocks and dragged to the moat, most of the castle is already at chapel or cleaning out their spring cloaks. The act is ceremonial now. A priest mutters a cleansing prayer as Garin, half conscious, is stripped to his under tunic and dumped into the water. It's not cleansing, it's execution by hygiene. You watch from the far steps. The moat stinks worse than usual. Frogs chirp like mockingbirds. When Garin emerges, shivering, gagging, broken, the guards haul him to the stable barn. Rest, they say. By dawn he's dead. His body is burned. No burial, no marker, but the smell lingers for days. Let's pause here for a reality check. You might be thinking, wasn't the church a force for mercy? Let's clear that up. The church was often a refuge for the rich, but for the poor it was a judge in holy robes. And when it came to justice, the church rarely interrupted the Lord's will. In fact, it endorsed it. Suffering was seen as spiritual purification, earthly punishment, a divine tool. So when Garin died, the priest simply said, his sins were washed away. Translation: we're not responsible. And what of you? You feel something breaking, a belief that there was a flaw beneath all this, that there were rules at least, if not fairness. But now, you realize the rules only protect those writing them. That night, the steward makes a quiet announcement at supper. All rumors of illness or treachery must be reported immediately. Silence will be punished. Punished how? No one asks. No one needs to. They all saw what happened to Garin. The very next day, another man is accused, this time for untrustworthy glances during mass. He's given lashings behind the barracks, 15 strokes, no trial. Just like that, the baron's system proves it's still working. Let's explore this system a bit more. Medieval castles weren't democracies. They were containment zones, walled laboratories where obedience was constantly tested and enforced. Law wasn't separate from authority. It was authority. The baron's word, backed by a priest's nod, was final. Worse yet, the punishments became entertainment. Children threw pebbles at stock prisoners. Maids gossiped about whippings the way they might discuss pastries. Blood was normalized. The question wasn't was he guilty, it was how loud did he scream. Even you aren't immune. You catch yourself laughing at a steward's joke about Garin's last breath. Not because it's funny, but because laughing means you're still one of them. It's survival instinct masquerading as cruelty. And so, the castle chapel bells ring. Banners are scrubbed for spring. The baron hosts a small feast to mark the cleansing of corruption. Duck is served, red wine flows, and no one mentions Garin. His name is already rotting in silence. Here's a cruel historical fact. Most people punished in medieval justice systems weren't recorded. No tombstones, no papers, no names passed down, only bruises on the ground where they once knelt. So next time someone says they knew how to keep order back then, ask them, order for whom? And at what cost? Chapter 12. A feast for the few. There, you wake to bells, not the chapel bells or alarm bells, but the ones they ring only for noble arrivals. Deep echoing chimes that reverberate through the stone, like a heartbeat for the whole castle. Something big is happening. You hear it in the rush of footsteps, In the sudden shouts of "clean the hall" and "fetch more torches," you're ordered to scrub the entryway stones with vinegar and ash until they shine, because the Baron's cousin is arriving, and she's married to a duke. Translation: time to pretend the castle doesn't constantly smell like damp rats and burnt broth. You mop, you sweep, you polish candlesticks until your fingers go numb. Above you, banners are unfurled, rich blue and red fabric sewn with golden thread, most of which has frayed or been patched over with paint, but from far away, looks expensive. That's the point. Nothing needs to be real, just convincing. Let's talk about noble theatre. Feasts and royal visits weren't just celebrations, they were performances, choreographed shows of wealth, order, and piety, and the real audience, not the guests, the servants, the villagers, the soldiers, the ones who needed reminding. Power is divine, inherited, and untouchable. You're pulled from polishing duty and told to assist in the great hall. The feast is tonight. Inside, chaos rules. The cook is shouting. A pig is roasting over a fire so big it could melt steel. Pigeons, stuffed with raisins and cloves, are arranged in towers. Trenchers, flat loaves of bread used as plates, are being baked by the dozen. The air smells like meat, salt and sweat, and in the middle of it all, the steward with a scroll longer than your leg, barking orders like a general. You're handed a ladle and told, stir the almond milk stew, clockwise only. Why clockwise? Because anti-clockwise stirs the devil. Obviously. Let's dissect this absurdity. Medieval nobility believed in symbolism. Everything meant something. The direction of stirring, the position of torches, the color of cloth, all tied to rank, purity, or tradition. Nothing was accidental, and breaking the form was a greater sin than spoiling the food. Meanwhile, half the servants haven't eaten a real meal in days. One of them, a girl named Isabet, leans in and whispers, "We're roasting 12 doves for them tonight." She chuckles, "I've never even seen 12 doves in my life." You laugh until you realize she's serious. The courtyard fills by noon. Nobles from nearby fiefdoms arrive, dressed in fur-trimmed cloaks and boots polished so sharply they could cut cheese. Their horses are perfumed. Yes, perfumed, because their status must be visible even from a distance, and olfactory. At sunset, the feast begins. You're assigned to carry trenchers and pour watered wine. You are invisible, unless you drop something, then you're unforgettable. That's how service works in the castle. The great hall is lit with candles. Dozens, maybe hundreds. It's bright enough to hide the cracks in the walls and the rotting spots on the ceiling beams. The Baron, seated on a raised dais, wears a new tunic dyed with imported woad. His cousin sits beside him, eyes scanning the room like she's trying to spot lice. The priest gives a blessing, filled with references to Solomon and divine bounty. The Baron nods solemnly, as if this feast is penance. Then the food comes out, platter after platter of extravagance stacked on poverty's bones. Let's list the dishes. Boar's head with spiced apples in its mouth, a pike fish shaped into a serpent of Eden, candied rose petals, a marchpane castle. Yes, a literal edible castle made of sugar and almond. You help place the dishes down, and you see it, no one is impressed. They've seen this before. These people aren't celebrating, they're competing, watching who eats what, who speaks to whom, who gets offered the duck legs instead of the neck bones. This isn't a meal, it's a ranking ceremony, disguised as dinner. And then come the performances. Yes, because eating wasn't enough. Musicians with rebecks and lutes play songs about noble valor. A juggler drops an apple and is nearly beaten by his handler. A poet recites a saga about the Baron's ancestor slaying a beast in Aquitaine. You recognize the story. Last week, a stable hand said that beast was actually just a drunk monk who wouldn't move off a bridge. But no one questions legend when it makes the Lord look noble. Let's pause for a bitter truth. These feasts weren't about the food. They were about establishing place, visually, spatially, socially. Where you sat told everyone what you were worth. What you were served told you whether you'd ever rise. If you got a seat at all, you'd already won the lottery. And servants, we weren't even pieces on the board. We were the table legs. At one point you glance across the room and see the steward laughing at something a knight said. Then he glances at you and stops. The smile dies. The message is clear, don't look too long. Eye contact is for equals. You pour more wine. You ignore the girl vomiting in the corner from overeating. You ignore the whispers about a nobleman's gout and another's bastard child. You just keep moving. Because you know this whole thing is a game, and you were never invited to play. Let's end this segment with clarity. Feasts in castles weren't just indulgence. They were rehearsals for control. Power wasn't merely enforced by sword, it was built in every chair's height, every course's timing, every torch's placement. The nobility didn't need to shout. They showed you their supremacy in every sugar sculpture and glove gesture. So the next time someone dreams of medieval banquets, remind them who was scrubbing the floors at midnight, and who was thrown in the moat when the wine ran short. Chapter 12. A Feast for the Few. Erde. You wake to bells, not the chapel bells or alarm bells, but the ones they ring only for noble arrivals. Deep echoing chimes that reverberate through the stone, like a heartbeat for the whole castle. Something big is happening. You hear it in the rush of footsteps, in the sudden shouts of clean the hall and fetch more torches. You're ordered to scrub the entryway stones with vinegar and ash until they shine, because the Baron's cousin is arriving, and she's married to a duke. Translation: time to pretend the castle doesn't constantly smell like damp rats and burnt broth. You mop, you sweep, you polish candlesticks until your fingers go numb. Above you, banners are unfurled, rich blue and red fabrics sewn with golden thread, most of which has frayed or been patched over with paint, but from far away, looks expensive. That's the point. Nothing needs to be real, just convincing. Let's talk about noble theatre. Feasts and royal visits weren't just celebrations, they were performances, choreographed shows of wealth, order, and piety, and the real audience, not the guests, the servants, the villagers, the soldiers, the ones who needed reminding. Power is divine, inherited, and untouchable. You're pulled from polishing duty and told to assist in the great hall. The feast is tonight. Inside, chaos rules. The cook is shouting. A pig is roasting over a fire so big it could melt steel. Pigeons, stuffed with raisins and cloves, are arranged in towers. Trenchers, flat loaves of bread used as plates, are being baked by the dozen. The air smells like meat, salt and sweat, and in the middle of it all, the steward with a scroll longer than your leg, barking orders like a general. You're handed a ladle and told, stir the almond milk stew, clockwise only. Why clockwise? Because anti-clockwise stirs the devil. Obviously. Let's dissect this absurdity. Medieval nobility believed in symbolism. Everything meant something. The direction of stirring, the position of torches, the color of cloth, all tied to rank, purity, or tradition. Nothing was accidental, and breaking the form was a greater sin than spoiling the food. Meanwhile, half the servants haven't eaten a real meal in days. One of them, a girl named Elisabeth, leans in and whispers, "We're roasting 12 doves for them tonight." She chuckles, "I've never even seen 12 doves in my life." You laugh until you realize she's serious. The courtyard fills by noon. Nobles from nearby fiefdoms arrive, dressed in fur-trimmed cloaks and boots polished so sharply they could cut cheese. Their horses are perfumed. Yes, perfumed, because their status must be visible even from a distance, and olfactory. At sunset, the feast begins. You're assigned to carry trenchers and pour watered wine. You are invisible, unless you drop something, then you're unforgettable. That's how service works in the castle. The great hall is lit with candles. Dozens, maybe hundreds. It's bright enough to hide the cracks in the walls and the rotting spots on the ceiling beams. The Baron, seated on a raised dais, wears a new tunic dyed with imported woad. His cousin sits beside him, eyes scanning the room like she's trying to spot lice. The priest gives a blessing, filled with references to Solomon and divine bounty. The Baron nods solemnly, as if this feast is penance. Then the food comes out, platter after platter of extravagance stacked on poverty's bones. Let's list the dishes. Boar's head with spiced apples in its mouth, a pike fish shaped into a serpent of Eden, candied rose petals, a marchpane castle. Yes, a literal edible castle made of sugar and almond. You help place the dishes down, and you see it, no one is impressed. They've seen this before. These people aren't celebrating, they're competing, watching who eats what, who speaks to whom, who gets offered the duck legs instead of the neck bones. This isn't a meal, it's a ranking ceremony, disguised as dinner. And then come the performances. Yes, because eating wasn't enough. Musicians with rebecks and lutes play songs about noble valor. A juggler drops an apple and is nearly beaten by his handler. A poet recites a saga about the Baron's ancestor slaying a beast in Aquitaine. You recognize the story. Last week, a stable hand said that beast was actually just a drunk monk who wouldn't move off a bridge. But no one questions legend when it makes the Lord look noble. Let's pause for a bitter truth. These feasts weren't about the food. They were about establishing place, visually, spatially, socially. Where you sat told everyone what you were worth. What you were served told you whether you'd ever rise. If you got a seat at all, you'd already won the lottery. And servants, we weren't even pieces on the board. We were the table legs. At one point you glance across the room and see the steward laughing at something a knight said. Then he glances at you and stops. The smile dies. The message is clear, don't look too long. Eye contact is for equals. You pour more wine. You ignore the girl vomiting in the corner from overeating. You ignore the whispers about a nobleman's gout and another's bastard child. You just keep moving. Because you know this whole thing is a game, and you were never invited to play. Let's end this segment with clarity. Feasts in castles weren't just indulgence. They were rehearsals for control. Power wasn't merely enforced by sword. It was built in every chair's height, every course's timing, every torch's placement. The nobility didn't need to shout. They showed you their supremacy in every sugar sculpture and glove gesture. So the next time someone dreams of medieval banquets, remind them who was scrubbing the floors at midnight, and who was thrown in the moat when the wine ran short. The candles have burned low. The laughter has dulled into groggy murmurs. Nobles slump in their seats, bellies distended, wine stains blooming like bruises on velvet sleeves. A few doze openly, others stagger off to chambers to relieve themselves, or collapse into perfumed beds. The feast is over, but for you, the night has just begun. The great hall, once echoing with flutes and feigned delight, now smells like spoiled milk, sweat and half-digested poultry. Trencher crumbs litter the floor. Grease coats the wooden tables. A fish spine lies discarded beneath the duke's chair, still twitching with flies. This is your battlefield now, the aftermath. You and half a dozen others descend upon the chaos. The steward's voice pierces the silence. No silver left behind. No spilled wine stains on the rushes, and no bones in sight come sunrise. He means it. There was once a servant who missed a goose bone beneath a bench. The baron stepped on it, slipped and sprained a toe. The servant, whipped twice and barred from supper for a week. You begin scraping dishes. Cold pigeon fat clings to your wrists. Someone vomited into a goblet. A child smeared candied almonds onto a tapestry worth more than your year's wage. You resist the urge to gag. Eusebet groans nearby, tugging a roast leg from under a bench. They didn't even eat it, she mutters. Just wanted to see it bleed when cut. That's the essence of it, isn't it? Consumption wasn't the point. Display was. What mattered wasn't the meal itself, but the suggestion of limitless abundance. Nobles wanted to be seen refusing food. That meant wealth. Gluttony was expected, but only in gestures, not necessity. The starving cook was praised for wasting more than anyone else had. You pile bones into a wooden bucket. A dog growls at you from under the table. Somewhere, a rat scurries through a platter of sugared pears, and the leftovers. They don't go to the poor. Not really. Some are tossed to the pigs, some to the guards. The best scraps are gathered into a side room, where select high-ranking servants are rewarded. You aren't one of them. You and dozens like you will eat nothing tonight. You will sleep with pigeon grease under your nails and the smell of spoiled meat in your hair. And you will rise tomorrow to do it again. Let's examine the economic insult of all this. The cost of one feast, between spices, imports, candles and musicians, could feed an entire village for a month. And yet nobles held feasts monthly, sometimes weekly, even during lean harvests. Because nobility wasn't about wisdom, it was about showing that rules don't apply to you. Peasants tightened belts, nobles loosened theirs, and when things got truly scarce, the feast became even more theatrical. You once heard the baron say, "Let the people see we still dine. It gives them hope." What he meant, let them believe we're unbothered by famine, so they don't rebel. It's power via delusion. At some point in the night a torch sputters out. You're told to relight it. The wax burns your knuckle. You curse under your breath. No one notices. The last of the wine barrels is carted off. One servant accidentally spills a drop on the stone floor. The steward glares. "You'll lick it if I say so," he snaps. He doesn't make the servant do it, but the silence that follows is louder than a scream. This is your training. Obedience rehearsed through humiliation. Outside the night air is still. The stars are sharp. You slip out briefly, pretending to gather rushes, just to breathe. In the courtyard you see a nobleman urinating on the stone fountain, too drunk to aim. His squire laughs. You duck away. This is who rules you. Men who mistake appetite for virtue and indulgence for leadership. Let's pull back the curtain on the myth of chivalry. The modern imagination loves a polished version of this world. Noble banquets, gleaming armor, high ideals. But that's fiction crafted centuries later by poets and painters. The reality, tables with rat droppings and spit-roasted swans. Nobles who beat servants with carved spoons. cooks who died from burns because the duck took too long, a boy who was whipped because he mispronounced the name of a spice. The Baron's page tripped while carrying a plate of pears soaked in rosewater. The pears hit the floor. The Baron laughed, then demanded the boy be slapped. So he learns that gravity has a cost. That boy limped for weeks. By dawn, the hall is mostly clean. The candles have burned down to stumps. The meat smell clings to the walls. The nobles snore behind oak doors, and the servants, sleepless and sore, are ordered to rise again in 2 hours to prepare for the morning's hunting procession. Because one feast is never enough, you catch Eusebet resting her eyes near the fire pit. The steward sees her, jabs her with the toe of his boot, and says, "No dreaming, that's for the noble born." You wish he was joking. Before the sun fully rises, you are back at it, scrubbing, hauling, boiling linens, laying fresh rushes. The only proof of last night's extravagance is a stain on your sleeve and a blister on your heel. And yet you're told to be grateful, because at least you're inside the walls. The villagers outside, they get no sugar, no duck, no trenchers, just scraps if they're lucky, and dirt if they're not. Their feast is watching the smoke from your chimneys and dreaming of the warmth inside. But if they dared complain, the priest would remind them, the nobles dine for you, their joy is your protection, their wealth is your grace. So next time someone sighs and says, "I wish I lived in a castle," you can smile and say, "Only if you plan to eat last," and scrub every inch of floor their power drips onto.
Imagine standing in that grand French castle, not as a guest, not as a knight, but as a nameless servant scraping pigeon fat off the stone floor at midnight, smelling other people's luxury, existing in a world where your silence is valued more than your spine. Now let's talk honestly, that wasn't civilization, it was decoration over decay. Medieval castles are often glorified in movies. We see long banquet tables, noblemen toasting, ladies in silk whispering poetry, but the reality was darker and dumber. Systems were built not for justice or order, but for control, punishment, and paranoia. And worst of all, everyone accepted it. Not because they loved it, but because they were told, this is just how things are. But what if we had been there? Let's get into some criticism, and then I'll tell you what could have changed. Not with fantasy, but with practical sense. First off, the justice system. If someone sneezed wrong, they were accused of heresy. The trials were nothing more than torture rituals masked as divine tests. This wasn't law, it was theatre with blood. Then there's medicine. Imagine bleeding someone out to balance the humours, because your textbook said so. While ignoring centuries of herbal knowledge, women in villages already practiced. Thousands died. Not from illness, but from ego in a robe and the food. Entire villages were starving. While inside the castle, nobles roasted birds, just to tear off the wings and throw them to dogs. It wasn't a feast, it was a performance of power, just to show that while others begged for bread, they could afford to waste sugar. So now here's the real question. If we were in their place, with the same limited resources, what would we have done differently? Let me tell you, we would have used the actual sources of knowledge they ignored. Women healers and midwives in villages, they understood herbs, poultices, and basic hygiene. Instead of silencing them as witches, we'd have created a community health system using their wisdom. The monks who copied medical text from the Islamic world and India used those translations not just for prestige, but for practical cures. Avicenna's canon of medicine was centuries ahead, and yet, left to rot in cold monasteries. Trial by fire, trial by drowning, no thanks. How about witness statements, cross-checking, and accountability? Even basic questioning could have saved innocent lives. And food distribution. We'd stop feeding egos and start feeding people. Instead of showing off 12 roasted doves, why not keep 2 and send 10 to the nearby village that harvested your grain in the first place? That's not charity, that's intelligent survival. A fed village is a peaceful village. But of course that required humility, something those castles were allergic to. And lastly, knowledge. Books weren't the problem. The gatekeeping was. What if we had opened up literacy to more than monks and barons' sons? What if every stable boy knew how to read a weather chart? What if every cook knew the biology of rot? The answer is simple. The world would have moved forward faster, cleaner, fairer, smarter. But instead, they clung to rituals, feared the stars and bowed to robes, instead of reason. So next time someone says I was born in the wrong era, I wish I lived in a medieval castle, just smile and say, only if you're bringing your own antibiotics, fairness and common sense.
Imagine standing in that grand French castle, not as a guest, not as a knight, but as a nameless servant scraping pigeon fat off the stone floor at midnight. Smelling other people's luxury, existing in a world where your silence is valued more than your spine. Now let's talk honestly, that wasn't civilization, it was decoration over decay. Medieval castles are often glorified in movies. We see long banquet tables, noblemen toasting, ladies in silk whispering poetry, but the reality was darker and dumber. Systems were built not for justice or order, but for control, punishment, and paranoia. And worst of all, everyone accepted it. Not because they loved it, but because they were told, this is just how things are. But what if we had been there? Let's get into some criticism, and then I'll tell you what could have changed. Not with fantasy, but with practical sense. First off, the justice system. If someone sneezed wrong, they were accused of heresy. The trials were nothing more than torture rituals masked as divine tests. This wasn't law, it was theatre with blood. Then there's medicine. Imagine bleeding someone out to balance the humours, because your textbook said so. While ignoring centuries of herbal knowledge, women in villages already practiced. Thousands died. Not from illness, but from ego in a robe and the food. Entire villages were starving. While inside the castle, nobles roasted birds, just to tear off the wings and throw them to dogs. It wasn't a feast, it was a performance of power, just to show that while others begged for bread, they could afford to waste sugar. So now here's the real question. If we were in their place, with the same limited resources, what would we have done differently? Let me tell you, we would have used the actual sources of knowledge they ignored. Women healers and midwives in villages, they understood herbs, poultices, and basic hygiene. Instead of silencing them as witches, we'd have created a community health system using their wisdom. The monks who copied medical text from the Islamic world and India used those translations not just for prestige, but for practical cures. Avicenna's canon of medicine was centuries ahead, and yet, left to rot in cold monasteries. Trial by fire, trial by drowning, no thanks. How about witness statements, cross-checking, and accountability? Even basic questioning could have saved innocent lives. And food distribution. We'd stop feeding egos and start feeding people. Instead of showing off 12 roasted doves, why not keep 2 and send 10 to the nearby village that harvested your grain in the first place? That's not charity, that's intelligent survival. A fed village is a peaceful village. But of course that required humility, something those castles were allergic to. And lastly, knowledge. Books weren't the problem. The gatekeeping was. What if we had opened up literacy to more than monks and barons' sons? What if every stable boy knew how to read a weather chart? What if every cook knew the biology of rot? The answer is simple. The world would have moved forward faster, cleaner, fairer, smarter. But instead, they clung to rituals, feared the stars and bowed to robes, instead of reason. So next time someone says I was born in the wrong era, I wish I lived in a medieval castle, just smile and say, only if you're bringing your own antibiotics, fairness and common sense. They feasted, others starved. They ruled with gold and blood. This was no fairy tale. You're watching the Drowsy Historian. Because if we were there, we wouldn't survive by fitting in. We'd survive by changing everything. Feasted, others starved. They ruled with gold and blood. This was no fairy tale. You're watching the Drowsy Historian.